Death, in some lands, meant releasing a body to the sky. In others, a soul freed by fire or flowers. Across continents, discover the strangest funeral rituals ever imagined. Mummies, burning ships, and shadows that refuse to fade. Hey friends, settle into your comfortable spot and imagine the warm desert sands of ancient Egypt, where death was just the beginning of an incredible journey toward eternal life. You're witnessing the most elaborate preservation ritual ever created, where bodies underwent a mystical 70-day transformation in candlelit chambers. Picture gentle hands of embalmers working with surgical precision while families maintained ritual silence, believing spoken words could interfere with spiritual processes. Mourners would fast and gather daily outside preparation houses, bringing offerings while priests chanted protective spells. The sweet scent of frankincense filled the air as artisans placed treasured amulets between hundreds of yards of linen bandages. What began as royal privilege eventually spread to common people, creating an entire industry where even farmers could afford basic mummification, promising eternal life in exchange for devotion to ancient gods. What dreams might those ancient souls still be dreaming, wrapped forever in their eternal embrace? You're standing on a misty Scandinavian shoreline around 800 AD, watching Norse warriors prepare their greatest send-off ceremony toward Valhalla's golden halls. The Vikings believed death was simply another voyage, so they placed honored chiefs in magnificent longships filled with treasures, weapons, and sometimes beloved horses. Mourners gathered at dawn carrying torches and singing ancient songs while the deceased was positioned with finest possessions for the warrior paradise. The ship would be set ablaze and pushed into dark fjord waters, creating a floating funeral pyre while families maintained strict silence during 3-day mourning periods. Archaeological evidence reveals many ship burials were actually vessels buried on land when timber became scarce. Yet maritime symbolism remained powerful. Some communities secretly continued water burials after Christianity arrived, adapting pagan traditions through creative interpretation. Can you hear those ancient war songs still echoing across northern waters toward eternal battlefields? Dear listeners, breathe deeply and transport yourself to Tibet's high plateaus, where death transforms into the most generous final act through sacred ceremonies embodying Buddhism's deepest teachings about compassion. In this ritual called Jator, families carry deceased to mountain platforms where monks prepare bodies for offering to vultures, transforming death into sustenance for other living beings. You're witnessing ceremonies where departed become final acts of compassion, feeding hungry animals while demonstrating Buddhist beliefs about temporary physical vessels offered generously to sustain life's endless cycle. Mourners gather before sunrise chanting prayers while butter tea steams and juniper incense carries offerings skyward. Bodies are carefully arranged as sacred feasts for circling birds, with families believing this practice allows loved ones to accumulate spiritual merit through final earthly generosity. What started as practical solution evolved into profound spiritual statement about impermanence and compassionate giving. What greater love exists than becoming nourishment for life itself in the eternal dance of giving? You're entering a dimly lit Victorian parlor where families gather around their most precious portraits, representing both love and loss in equal measure. During the 1800s, when photography was expensive, many families commissioned their only formal portrait, including deceased loved ones, creating an industry of post-mortem photography, preserving final memories with artistic dignity. Picture gentle positioning of bodies in lifelike poses, seated among relatives or surrounded by flowers and meaningful belongings telling stories of lives well lived. Mourners commissioned these as final opportunities to preserve images forever, with photographers spending hours creating elaborate scenes using primitive techniques. Children appeared sleeping peacefully while adults held cherished objects representing earthly passions. Families treasured these images above all possessions, displaying them prominently and carrying smaller versions in lockets worn close to hearts. Specialized photographers advertised post-mortem services in newspapers, offering artistic memorial portraits capturing both physical likeness and spiritual essence. What eternal stories do those sepia-toned gazes hold in their silent, forever fixed expressions? Hey friends, close your eyes and step into ancient Rome, where death sparked spectacular celebrations lasting days through community competitions honoring the deceased. You're witnessing gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances held to ensure successful afterlife journeys while demonstrating wealth through public entertainment. Wealthy families spent fortunes organizing elaborate funeral games, believing entertainment pleased deceased spirits and judging gods, while displaying social status through increasingly spectacular public spectacles. Mourners participated by cheering from amphitheaters, while professional entertainers risked lives in sand arenas, creating atmospheres where death became celebration rather than somber reflection. The custom originated from Etruscan beliefs that combat blood nourished dead spirits, strengthening them for dangerous underworld journeys. Families competed to host most memorable games, sometimes bankrupting themselves with exotic animals and famous gladiators entertaining thousands for weeks. Roman law eventually limited funeral expenditures, though wealthy families circumvented restrictions through private celebrations. What thunderous applause still echoes in those ancient arenas, celebrating lives long forgotten. You're settling into a cozy Irish cottage where community warmth transforms grief into celebration, making death a doorway to cherished memories connecting generations through storytelling. Traditional wakes involved constant vigil over deceased for 3 days, with families sharing stories and songs ensuring souls weren't lonely during transition toward mysterious afterlife destinations. Picture mourners taking turns beside bodies, talking as if still alive, sharing news while kitchens buzzed with neighbors, preparing endless meals, providing comfort through food and fellowship. The practice created reunion atmospheres rather than somber funerals, with musicians playing gentle tunes, celebrating favorite songs while storytellers shared memories, keeping personalities alive through oral traditions. Families believed constant companionship prevented evil spirits from claiming souls, so someone remained awake throughout nights, maintaining protective vigil through prayer and loving community presence. Traditional games and storytelling contests helped maintain vigils while honoring deceased through laughter and shared cultural activities. Whiskey and tobacco were offered to visitors, creating generous hospitality, transforming mourning houses into celebration centers. What ancient wisdom still flows through those timeless stories told beside flickering candlelight? Dear listeners, imagine entering serene Japanese temples where families gather for one of the most intimate funeral customs ever practiced. After cremation, family members participate in kotsuage, sacred bone-picking ceremonies, using special chopsticks passed between relatives, symbolically reconstructing their loved one's journey from earthly existence toward spiritual liberation. You're witnessing generations working together, starting with smallest bone fragments and progressing toward skulls, guiding spirits through transformation from physical form to eternal consciousness, according to Buddhist teachings. Temples fill with gentle sounds of ceramic urns and whispered prayers as each member selects precious fragments with infinite care, creating intensely personal farewell moments where families directly handle final physical forms. This practice creates profound intimacy Western customs rarely achieve, allowing direct participation in transitions rather than distant observation behind professional barriers. Mourners spend hours contemplating each fragment, while trained monks provide guidance through chanted sutras and gentle instruction about proper spiritual protocols. Some families preserve certain fragments in household shrines for daily remembrance and ancestor veneration. What gentle peace flows through those careful hands, carrying love across death's mysterious threshold. You're standing beside ancient Mediterranean shores where Greek families perform small but crucial rituals, determining their loved one's eternal fate in mysterious underworld realms. Mourners carefully place coins over deceased eyes or mouths, providing payment for Charon, the mythical ferryman transporting souls across dark river Styx toward final judgment destinations. Picture families gathering precious silver obols while whispering prayers expressing hopes for safe passage across supernatural waters separating living from departed spirits. This simple act carried enormous responsibility because without proper ferry payment, souls would wander gloomy riverbanks for 100 years, unable to reach designated resting places in underworld regions. Wealthy families used gold coins, while poorer mourners scraped together copper pieces, believing any payment was better than leaving loved ones stranded without means completing necessary journeys toward divine judgment. Archaeological excavations continue revealing graves with coins placed exactly as prescribed by tradition, proving this practice remained important across centuries and social classes sharing common afterlife beliefs. Some communities developed elaborate variations, including special funeral currency and complex ceremonies for souls making particularly dangerous underworld journeys. What ancient voices still call across those mythical waters seeking safe harbor in eternity? Hey friends, let warm evening air carry you to Mexico, where families create magical pathways for returning spirits during Dia de los Muertos celebrations, transforming cemeteries into vibrant festivals, connecting living and dead through love and joyous reunion. You're watching communities work for weeks, decorating graves with marigold petals, candles, and elaborate altars loaded with deceased favorites, welcoming beloved relatives home for precious nights of spiritual visitation. Mourners spend months preparing special bread, crafting paper flowers, and gathering items different family members enjoyed, believing these offerings guide wandering souls back through sensory memories. Sweet copal incense mingles with fresh tortillas and hot chocolate, while families settle beside gravestones for overnight vigils combining prayer, storytelling, and peaceful communion with annually returning ancestors. Children learn communicating with departed relatives through respectful conversation, treating death as another family relationship stage rather than final separation. This ancient Aztec tradition survived Spanish colonization by blending with Catholic All Saints' Day, creating unique hybrid celebrations, preserving indigenous beliefs within acceptable Christian frameworks. Families maintain traditional recipes passed down through generations, creating culinary connections between past and present. What joyful reunions bloom like marigolds in that sacred space between life and eternal memory. You're climbing through misty Ethiopian highlands where families retreat to ancient cave sanctuaries for Christianity's most intensive mourning periods, requiring complete separation from worldly concerns during 40 days of prayer, fasting, and spiritual purification following beloved deaths. Orthodox mourners enter holy spaces carved by medieval monks, believing grief requires total isolation, while focusing on spiritual preparation for loved ones' divine judgment journeys. Picture gentle oil lamp glows, illuminating rock walls covered with centuries-old Ge'ez prayers, while families chant traditional hymns, echoing through stone chambers with perfect acoustics, enhancing mystical atmosphere through resonant sound connecting earthly mourning with heavenly worship. Community members deliver simple meals while maintaining protective vigil fires, ensuring mourning families remain safely isolated yet properly supported during intensive spiritual retreats from ordinary social obligations. The caves, carved into cliffsides by early Christian hermits seeking perfect solitude, provide ideal environments for contemplative mourning, removing grieving families from worldly concerns except spiritual preparation. Families believe intensive spiritual work helps guide loved ones through divine judgment while purifying their own souls through concentrated grief, transforming sorrow into deeper spiritual understanding. Some caves contain ancient burial chambers, making them doubly sacred for mourning rituals. What eternal prayers still resonate through those sacred stone chambers, carrying love across centuries? Hey friends, if you're finding peace in these gentle stories of how humans honor their departed, don't forget to subscribe for more calming tales from history's fascinating corners. Dear listeners, imagine stepping into a medieval cathedral where painted walls come alive with the most haunting yet beautiful funeral procession ever created. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, emerged during 14th century plague years as communities processed through streets led by skeletal figures who danced with people from every social class toward inevitable destiny. You're witnessing kings and peasants, bishops and beggars, all following death's choreographed steps in elaborate pageants that transformed fear into acceptance of mortality's universal democracy. Mourners would join these processions during funeral ceremonies, believing the dance reminded everyone that death comes to all, regardless of wealth or status, making earthly distinctions meaningless before divine judgment. The gentle sound of bells and chanted prayers accompanied slow, deliberate movements while families commissioned artists to paint these scenes on church walls, creating permanent reminders of death's equalizing power. The custom spread across Europe through traveling performers who staged elaborate death pageants during funeral seasons, with some communities developing secret variations where political dissidents used anonymity to mock corrupt rulers. These processions required skilled costume makers, choreographers, and musicians who transformed collective fear into philosophical acceptance through carefully planned democratic demonstrations. What wisdom flows through those ancient steps that made emperors and servants dance as equals? You're walking through ancient Indian villages where carved stone monuments tell stories of wives who chose to join husbands in death through the controversial practice of sati. These memorial sati stones marked spots where women immolated themselves on funeral pyres, believing this ultimate sacrifice ensured eternal unity with departed spouses, while demonstrating supreme devotion that transcended earthly existence. Picture families gathering around these monuments during anniversary ceremonies, offering flowers and incense while reciting prayers for marital happiness and spiritual strength, seeking blessings from heroic souls they commemorated through elaborate ritual observances. The practice created complex community responses, with some viewing it as supreme devotion while others questioned its necessity, leading to heated theological debates about proper expressions of wifely loyalty and spiritual commitment. Mourners developed elaborate rituals around these memorials, including annual festivals where women sought blessings for successful marriages while honoring sacrifice through collective prayers and offerings. British colonial authorities eventually banned the practice after witnessing these ceremonies, but memorial stones remained as testament to beliefs about love transcending death through ultimate sacrifice. Many communities secretly continued memorial ceremonies even after prohibition, adapting traditions to honor sacrifice, without encouraging repetition through modified ritual practices that preserved spiritual meaning while avoiding legal consequences. What eternal love stories rest in those weathered stones, speaking across centuries of devotion? Hey friends, close your eyes and feel warm Pacific breezes as you discover how Polynesian islanders created the most elevated funeral ceremonies in the ancient world. Chiefs and important community members were placed on high wooden platforms called fail, where bodies could begin spiritual journeys closer to ancestors in sky realms, where divine chiefs continued ruling celestial territories. You're witnessing entire villages gathering below these sacred platforms, maintaining constant vigils while drums beat gentle rhythms and families share stories of the deceased's great deeds and spiritual accomplishments that earned them elevated burial honors. Mourners took turns climbing sacred ladders to place offerings of food, flowers, and personal treasures beside their loved ones, believing proximity to sky realms enhanced spiritual communication with departing souls. The practice required master craftsmen who built elaborate platforms decorated with carvings telling individual life stories through traditional symbols representing family lineage, personal achievements, and spiritual status within community hierarchies. Natural decomposition under tropical skies was viewed as gradual transformation rather than decay, with families monitoring the process as spiritual progression toward complete integration with ancestral sky spirits. Some platforms remained standing for generations, becoming shrines where descendants sought guidance from elevated ancestors who maintained protective watch over living communities. Colonial missionaries later prohibited these heathen practices, forcing communities to adopt underground burials, contradicting beliefs about spiritual ascension toward celestial realms. What ancient wisdom rises on those ocean winds carrying souls toward their celestial homes? You're entering traditional Russian Orthodox homes where mirrors hang draped in black cloth, creating mysterious atmospheres during sacred 40-day mourning periods following deaths. Families believed uncovered mirrors could trap departing souls, preventing peaceful journeys to afterlife realms. So every reflective surface in houses was carefully concealed through elaborate covering ceremonies performed by elderly women experienced in proper spiritual protocols. Picture mourners moving through darkened rooms, where candlelight flickers against covered glass, while prayers echo through spaces transformed into spiritual sanctuaries dedicated to guiding souls toward divine judgment and eternal rest. The practice required family members to maintain constant awareness of reflection, covering everything from window glass to polished metal surfaces that might interfere with spiritual transitions through supernatural realms between earthly existence and heavenly destinations. Communities developed elaborate systems for checking each other's homes, ensuring no mirror remained exposed that might endanger deceased spiritual progress through complex afterlife geography described in orthodox theological texts and traditional folklore. Some families hired professional mirror watchers who specialized in identifying overlooked reflective surfaces during mourning periods, creating cottage industries around spiritual protection services. The custom created unique challenges in wealthy homes filled with mirrors, requiring teams of people to properly drape every surface while maintaining continuous vigil against accidental exposure. Secret Orthodox communities in Soviet times adapted practices using modern materials, maintaining ancient beliefs despite official atheism through underground networks. What ghostly reflections still shimmer behind those draped mirrors, waiting for safe passage home? Dear listeners, breathe deeply and transport yourself to the Australian outback where Aboriginal communities practice one of the world's most spiritually intense funeral justice rituals. When someone dies under suspicious circumstances, tribal elders perform bone-pointing ceremonies using specially prepared kangaroo or emu bones to seek supernatural justice for deceased through divine intervention rather than conventional tribal law enforcement. You're witnessing ancient protocols where communities gather in sacred circles while shamans chant in traditional languages, pointing consecrated bones toward suspected wrongdoers who fear supernatural consequences more than earthly punishment from human authorities. Mourners maintain absolute silence during these ceremonies, believing spoken words could misdirect spiritual energy seeking truth and retribution through cosmic justice systems that connect earthly crimes with supernatural punishment. The pointed bone becomes a conduit between living and dead, carrying the deceased's demand for justice across both physical and spiritual realms, while channeling ancestral power toward resolution of earthly conflicts through divine intervention. Families spend days preparing for these ceremonies, gathering specific materials and purifying themselves through traditional rituals that ensure proper spiritual preparation for invoking supernatural justice mechanisms. The practice often led to confessions from guilty parties who feared supernatural consequences more than legal punishment, demonstrating continued belief in spiritual justice systems. Colonial authorities misunderstood these ceremonies as primitive superstition, failing to recognize sophisticated roles in maintaining social justice and community healing through traditional conflict resolution. What ancient justice flows through those sacred bones, bridging worlds in search of truth. You're standing in traditional Chinese courtyards where families burn elaborate paper replicas of money, houses, and luxury goods to ensure deceased relatives live comfortably in afterlife realms through the most generous banking system ever designed for departed souls. This practice, called joss paper burning, creates spiritual economics where mourners invest heavily in loved ones' eternal prosperity by providing supernatural currency for purchasing comfort in otherworldly markets. Picture gentle flames consuming detailed paper creations, while sweet incense smoke carries these offerings skyward to ancestral spirits who need material wealth for successful navigation of complex afterlife bureaucracies and social hierarchies. Families compete to create the most elaborate paper goods, including modern items like smartphones, cars, and designer clothing for departed relatives who continue needing contemporary conveniences in spiritual realms that mirror earthly society. The ritual requires careful timing, with specific burning ceremonies scheduled during traditional festivals and anniversary dates throughout the year when spiritual communication becomes most effective through seasonal transitions. Communities developed specialized craftspeople who create incredibly detailed paper replicas, from tiny credit cards to full-scale mansions complete with furniture and modern appliances designed specifically for spiritual consumption. Some families secretly burn real currency during private ceremonies, believing actual money provides more purchasing power in spirit world economies. Modern variations include paper versions of contemporary technology, showing how ancient beliefs adapt to current lifestyle needs while maintaining traditional spiritual frameworks. What celestial economy thrives on those generous flames, powered by love across life and death? Hey friends, imagine climbing ancient stone towers in Persia, where Zoroastrians practiced the world's most environmentally conscious funeral ritual for over 1,000 years. These circular towers of silence, called dogma, elevated bodies above ground where vultures could cleanly consume flesh, leaving only bones to bleach pure in desert sunlight while avoiding contamination of sacred elements through traditional burial or cremation practices. You're witnessing families gathering at tower bases while specially trained corpse bearers carried loved ones up narrow stone stairs to circular platforms divided into sections for men, women, and children, according to traditional gender and age hierarchies maintained even in death. Mourners maintained ritual purity by never touching deceased directly, believing death temporarily contaminated anything it contacted, requiring specialized handling by professional corpse bearers trained in proper spiritual protocols for managing dangerous spiritual contamination. The practice reflected deep environmental wisdom, preventing burial contamination of sacred earth or cremation pollution of holy fire while integrating human death with natural ecological cycles through generous feeding of scavenging wildlife. Communities built these towers on hilltops, far from settlements, creating peaceful places where death became part of natural cycles while maintaining safe distances from living populations who might suffer spiritual contamination. Families visited towers periodically to collect sun-bleached bones, which were stored in central ossuary wells within each structure, creating permanent memorial sites. Modern urban development and declining vulture populations eventually made this practice impossible in many areas, forcing adaptations to traditional beliefs. What ancient wisdom soars with those patient vultures, transforming death into sky-bound freedom? You're entering quiet chambers in medieval Baghdad, where Muslim families perform one of the world's most detailed and loving body preparation rituals. The Islamic washing ceremony, ghusl, requires specific movements, prayers, and materials, as community members carefully cleanse deceased with warm water scented with camphor and other sacred substances, according to precise religious instructions passed down through centuries of Islamic tradition. Picture gentle hands moving in prescribed patterns, while soft recitations of Quranic verses fill the air with peaceful melodies that guide souls toward divine judgment and eternal rest in paradise gardens. The ritual must be performed by same-gender community members who volunteer for this sacred duty, creating bonds of service between families and neighbors while demonstrating Islamic principles of mutual aid and spiritual brotherhood. Mourners prepare by gathering specific materials, including clean white cloth, pure water, and traditional fragrances, treating each element as prayer offering that honors deceased, while following Prophet Muhammad's example and teachings. The ceremony requires precise choreography, with washers moving from right to left in specific sequences, while maintaining reverent silence between prayer recitations that sanctify each step of purification process. Communities developed elaborate protocols for training washing specialists who could perform these rites with perfect accuracy and spiritual intention, ensuring deceased receive proper preparation for meeting Allah. Some regions created beautiful washing chambers with marble tables and intricate water systems, designed specifically for funeral purification rituals that combined practical necessity with artistic beauty. What gentle prayers flow through those careful hands, preparing souls for their eternal journey. Dear listeners, feel crisp Arctic air as you discover how Inuit communities transformed winter's harsh embrace into the most natural preservation system ever developed. During long polar nights, families would place deceased in snow houses where sub-zero temperatures naturally mummified bodies, allowing extended mourning periods and spiritual preparation while maintaining physical connection with loved ones through winter months when travel was impossible. You're witnessing communities gathering in ice chambers where aurora borealis filters through translucent walls, creating ethereal lighting for funeral vigils that combine practical necessity with spiritual reverence for departed family members. Mourners carved elaborate ice sculptures and snow reliefs around their loved ones, transforming burial chambers into frozen art galleries, celebrating individual life achievements while demonstrating artistic skills passed down through generations of Arctic craftspeople. The practice required master igloo builders who could construct special funeral chambers with perfect temperature control and ventilation systems that preserved bodies without artificial techniques while providing comfortable spaces for extended family gatherings. Families maintained oil lamps that provided gentle warmth for visitors without disturbing natural preservation processes that depended on consistent sub-zero temperatures throughout winter months. The custom allowed extended family members from distant settlements to travel across frozen landscapes for final farewells during brief Arctic summers when transportation became possible again. Spring ceremonies involved careful transportation of preserved remains to permanent burial or platform sites chosen during warmer months when ground conditions permitted traditional interment. What eternal dreams rest in those crystal chambers, cradled by winter's gentle preservation. You're walking through misty Celtic forests, where ancient Druids practiced one of Europe's most mystical funeral traditions, believing human heads contained eternal souls and deserved special reverence after death. Celtic warriors and priests carefully preserved heads of honored dead, creating shrine collections where families could commune with ancestral wisdom, stored in these sacred vessels that retained spiritual power long after physical death. Picture moonlight filtering through oak groves where families gathered around head shrines, seeking guidance from ancestors whose souls remained accessible through preserved remains that served as permanent communication links between living and dead. The practice required specialized preservation techniques using natural herbs, oils, and smoking methods that Celtic Druids guarded as sacred knowledge passed down through generations of spiritual practitioners trained in complex funeral arts. Communities built elaborate shrine houses where multiple generations of family heads were displayed with honor, creating ancestral councils that guided tribal decisions through continued participation of deceased leaders in community governance. Mourners brought offerings of food, drink, and flowers to these shrines, maintaining relationships with deceased relatives through regular conversations and ceremonies that treated death as transition rather than termination of family bonds. Roman conquerors later destroyed most evidence of these practices, viewing them as barbaric superstitions that threatened imperial authority and Christian conversion efforts throughout Celtic territories. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing hidden Celtic head shrines, suggesting the practice survived longer than historical records indicate through secret maintenance of traditional spiritual practices. What ancient counsel whispers through those sacred groves where wisdom transcends life's boundaries? You're climbing high into the Andes Mountains, where ancient Peruvian civilizations created the most elaborate mummy bundles the world has ever seen, transforming death into artistic masterpieces. These fardos involved wrapping deceased family members in layers of precious textiles, creating cocoon-like bundles that could contain hundreds of yards of intricate weavings. Picture families gathering around their loved ones as master weavers carefully position jewelry, food offerings, and personal treasures between each colorful layer of cloth. Mourners would spend months preparing these bundles, with entire communities contributing their finest textiles to honor the deceased. The practice required skilled artisans who knew precisely how to position bodies and arrange grave goods to create balanced, beautiful bundles. Families believed these wrappings provided protection and comfort during the soul's journey to the afterlife. Some bundles contained false heads made from gourds, decorated to represent the person's appearance in life. Spanish conquistadors later destroyed thousands of these artistic mummy bundles, viewing them as pagan idolatry rather than recognizing their profound cultural significance. What dreams rest within those ancient textiles woven with generations of love and devotion? Dear listeners, imagine walking through traditional Korean villages where towering wooden poles carved with fierce faces stand sentinel over burial grounds, protecting the dead from malevolent spirits. These Gyeongsung funeral guardians, some reaching 20 feet tall, were carved by master craftsmen who imbued each face with protective power through sacred rituals and ancestral blessings. You're witnessing families gathering around these wooden sentinels during funeral ceremonies, offering rice wine and prayers while shamans chant protective spells. The poles required annual maintenance ceremonies where communities would refresh paint, repair weather damage, and renew spiritual protections through elaborate rituals. Mourners believed these guardians could communicate with both spirits and ancestors, serving as intermediaries between the living and dead. Villages competed to create the most powerful Gyeongsung, with some communities hiring famous carvers who specialized in protective spiritual art. The practice created unique burial landscapes where forests of guardian poles created sacred groves around cemeteries. Modern development destroyed many traditional Gyeongsung sites, though some communities secretly maintained smaller guardian poles in hidden locations. What ancient protection flows through those carved wooden faces, standing eternal watch over peaceful souls? Hey friends, close your eyes and feel the warm tropical air of Bali, where Hindu communities transform cremation into the most joyous celebration of death's liberation from earthly suffering. Ngaben ceremonies involve entire villages working together to build elaborate paper and bamboo structures shaped like mythical animals, palaces, and sacred mountains. You're witnessing hundreds of people carrying these artistic cremation towers through narrow village streets while gamelan orchestras play hypnotic melodies that guide souls toward spiritual freedom. Families spend years saving money for these magnificent ceremonies, believing elaborate celebrations ensure their loved ones achieve moksha or liberation from the cycle of rebirth. The practice requires master craftsmen who specialize in building temporary architectural wonders designed to burn beautifully. Mourners dress in white and yellow, colors of purity and gold, while participating in processions that can last entire days. Communities rotate responsibilities for different aspects of the ceremony, creating complex social networks of mutual support and artistic collaboration. Some families combine multiple cremations to share costs, creating even more spectacular festivals that celebrate several souls simultaneously. What joyous liberation rises with those sacred flames carrying souls toward eternal freedom. You're standing in the East African savannah, where Maasai communities practice one of the world's most environmentally integrated funeral customs, placing their honored elders beneath sacred trees where their bodies nourish the forest ecosystem. Only respected elders who achieved cultural significance receive tree burial, with most Maasai traditionally leaving bodies for scavengers in a practice that honors the circle of life. Picture families gathering beneath ancient baobab and acacia trees while elders recount the deceased's contributions to tribal wisdom and community leadership. The practice requires careful selection of trees based on spiritual significance, with different species chosen for different types of leaders and wisdom keepers. Mourners maintain these sacred groves through generations, creating forest sanctuaries where ancestors literally become part of the living landscape. Communities developed elaborate protocols for tree selection, with shamans consulting spiritual signs before designating burial locations. The custom created unique forest ecosystems where human remains enriched soil that supported wildlife and provided shade for future ceremonies. Colonial authorities often misunderstood these practices, viewing them as primitive rather than recognizing their sophisticated ecological wisdom. What ancient wisdom grows in those sacred groves where ancestors become living forests? Dear listeners, descend into the mysterious catacombs beneath Palermo, where Sicilian families created the world's most theatrical funeral displays, dressing their deceased in finest clothing and arranging them in lifelike poses for eternal social gatherings. The Capuchin catacombs housed thousands of mummified bodies arranged by profession, gender, and social status, creating underground cities where death became an elaborate social performance. You're witnessing families visiting their mummified relatives, changing their clothes seasonally, and maintaining conversations with preserved loved ones who seem to participate in eternal community life. The practice required specialized preservation techniques using arsenic, lime, and careful ventilation systems that naturally mummified bodies in the dry catacomb environment. Mourners paid annual fees to maintain their family sections, creating economic systems around death display that supported the monastery for centuries. Communities developed elaborate visiting protocols, with families scheduling regular social calls to update their deceased relatives on family news and seek guidance from preserved ancestors. Some wealthy families commissioned new outfits annually for their mummified relatives, maintaining fashion consciousness even in death. What eternal conversations echo through those silent halls where death joined the social season? You're walking across the Great Plains, where Native American tribes created the most elevated funeral platforms ever built, raising their deceased high above the earth on wooden scaffolds that connected earthly life with celestial spirits. These platforms, built from carefully selected trees, and decorated with personal belongings, allowed natural decomposition while preventing ground burial that tribes believed interfered with spiritual ascension. Picture families gathering beneath these sacred scaffolds while medicine men perform ceremonies that guide souls through the complex journey between earthly and spirit worlds. The practice required master craftsmen who understood both engineering principles and spiritual protocols for creating platforms strong enough to withstand prairie winds while maintaining sacred proportions. Mourners left food offerings and personal items on platforms, maintaining relationships with deceased relatives through regular visits and ceremonial renewals. Communities developed elaborate protocols for platform construction, with different designs for warriors, elders, children, and spiritual leaders. Buffalo robes and other precious materials wrapped bodies while families sang traditional songs that carried prayers skyward. Government agents later forced many tribes to abandon scaffold burial, requiring ground interment that contradicted fundamental spiritual beliefs. What ancient songs still rise on prairie winds, carrying souls toward their celestial homes? Hey friends, imagine entering a medieval Welsh cottage where communities practice one of history's most mysterious funeral customs, hiring designated individuals to literally eat the sins of the deceased through ritualized consumption of bread and ale. These sin-eaters performed sacred services by consuming meals placed on corpses, believing this act transferred the dead person's spiritual burdens to the living, ensuring clean passage to the afterlife. You're witnessing families gathering around deathbeds, while sin-eaters perform solemn ceremonies that combined pagan traditions with Christian beliefs about spiritual cleansing and redemption. The practice created complex social dynamics, with sin-eaters occupying essential yet marginalized positions in their communities, respected for their spiritual service, yet feared for their contamination with accumulated sins. Mourners paid sin-eaters modest fees for these services, creating economic systems around spiritual labor that sustained these specialists through generations. Communities developed elaborate protocols for sin-eating ceremonies, including specific foods, prayers, and timing requirements that varied between regions. Some sin-eaters specialized in particular types of deaths, with different rituals for sudden deaths, long illnesses, or deaths involving unresolved conflicts. The practice gradually disappeared as church authorities condemned it as superstition. What ancient hungers were satisfied at those sacred meals where sin became sustenance? You're kneeling in a traditional Japanese crematorium where families perform one of the world's most intimate post-cremation rituals, using special chopsticks to carefully select and transfer their loved one's bones from ashes to sacred urns. This katsuage ceremony requires family members to work together in specific order, starting with the youngest and progressing to eldest, creating collaborative reconstruction of their family members' remains. Picture the gentle clicking of ceramic and bamboo chopsticks as relatives carefully examine each bone fragment, discussing memories and sharing final moments of physical connection with their deceased loved one. The practice demands precise protocol knowledge, with funeral directors quietly guiding families through proper techniques while maintaining reverent atmosphere throughout the delicate process. Mourners often spend hours completing katsuage ceremonies, treating each bone selection as meditation on mortality and family connection. Communities developed specialized chopstick designs specifically for funeral use, with different materials and lengths, designated for various ceremonial purposes. Some families preserve certain bone fragments in separate containers, keeping them in home altars for daily remembrance and ancestor veneration. Modern urban crematoria adapted traditional katsuage to accommodate larger families and time constraints, while preserving essential spiritual elements. What gentle reverence flows through those careful fingers, reconstructing love bone by bone? Dear listeners, breathe deeply as you climb toward sacred Andean peaks, where Inca communities practiced the most elevated funeral ceremonies ever performed, offering specially chosen children to mountain gods through elaborate mummification rituals at extreme altitudes. These Capacocha ceremonies involved year-long preparations where selected children were treated as divine messengers, traveling throughout the empire before final placement in mountain shrines above 20,000 feet elevation. You're witnessing communities gathering to honor these sacred children with feasts, ceremonies, and precious offerings before their transformation into eternal mountain guardians. The practice required master priests who understood both spiritual protocols and high-altitude survival techniques necessary for conducting ceremonies in the thin air of sacred peaks. Families considered selection for Capacocha the highest honor possible, believing their children would become powerful intermediaries between human communities and mountain spirits. These ceremonies created pilgrimage networks throughout the Inca Empire, with people traveling hundreds of miles to participate in sacred mountain rituals. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing perfectly preserved child mummies at extreme altitudes, along with elaborate grave goods including gold, silver, and precious textiles. Spanish conquistadors destroyed most records of these practices, viewing them as demonic rather than understanding their profound spiritual significance. What eternal prayers echo from those silent peaks where young souls became mountain guardians. You're swaying to gentle rhythms in Madagascar, where Malagasy families practice the world's most joyous, bone-turning ceremony, exhuming their ancestors every 7 years to dance with their remains before re-wrapping them in fresh silk shrouds. This Famadihana celebration transforms cemeteries into festival grounds where death becomes reason for family reunions, music, and abundant feasting with both living and deceased relatives. Picture extended families gathering from distant villages, carrying their ancestors' bundled remains in celebratory processions, while live bands play traditional music that makes even bones seem to dance with joy. The practice requires families to save money for years to afford new silk shrouds, fresh tomb maintenance, and elaborate feasts that can feed hundreds of relatives and neighbors. Mourners use these ceremonies to update ancestors on family news, introduce new babies, and seek blessings for upcoming marriages, business ventures, and other important life transitions. Communities compete to host the most magnificent Famadihana celebrations, with some families hiring professional musicians and preparing traditional foods for days. The custom creates unique economic cycles where silk merchants, musicians, and food vendors depend on regular grave opening seasons for significant portions of their annual income. What joyous rhythms connect those dancing bones with beating hearts across the threshold of life? You're settling into marble seats of the Colosseum, where Roman families transformed grief into spectacular entertainment, hosting elaborate gladiatorial combats to honor their deceased loved ones. These munera, or funeral games, began as Etruscan blood offerings, but evolved into magnificent spectacles where families competed to provide the most memorable farewell celebrations. Picture thousands of spectators cheering while professional fighters risked their lives in sand arenas, believing spilled blood nourished the spirits of the dead and ensured their peaceful journey to the underworld. Wealthy Romans spent fortunes on these events, sometimes bankrupting entire estates to surpass rival families' funeral displays. Mourners attended these games wearing special mourning attire, while vendors sold food and wine, creating festival atmospheres around death ceremonies. The practice required elaborate planning, with families booking gladiators months in advance and coordinating with arena officials for optimal scheduling. Some families secretly hired actors to stage less dangerous mock combats when budgets couldn't afford real gladiatorial contests. Eventually, Christian influence transformed these blood sports into charitable distributions and religious ceremonies. What thunderous applause still echoes in those ancient stones, celebrating lives through mortal combat. Dear listeners, Close your eyes and feel the desert wind as you witness Sudanese Sufi communities practicing the most hypnotic funeral ceremony ever created, spinning in ecstatic dances that guide departed souls through their journey to divine union. These mystical, whirling ceremonies, performed by trained dervishes, create spiritual vortexes that mourners believe help deceased loved ones transcend earthly attachments and merge with eternal divine consciousness. You're watching white-robed figures spinning for hours, while drummers maintain hypnotic rhythms that induce trance states in both performers and grieving families. The practice requires years of training to master the precise movements, breathing techniques, and spiritual focus necessary to achieve the ecstatic states that facilitate soul guidance. Mourners join these ceremonies by chanting sacred phrases and maintaining meditative focus, while dervishes whirl in increasingly rapid circles around symbolic grave markers. Communities developed elaborate protocols for different types of deaths, with specific whirling patterns designated for martyrs, saints, children, and ordinary believers. Some colonial authorities banned these ceremonies as dangerous fanaticism, forcing practitioners to perform secret nighttime whirling rituals in remote desert locations. What divine ecstasy spirals through those ancient movements, carrying souls toward eternal unity? Hey, friends. Imagine gathering in cedar longhouses along Alaska's misty coastlines, where Tlingit communities practice the most generous funeral custom ever developed, giving away vast quantities of wealth to honor their deceased and establish their social status. These memorial potlatches involve families distributing blankets, copper shields, carved artwork, and even slaves to demonstrate their love for the departed while securing their position in complex social hierarchies. Picture elaborate feasts where hundreds of guests receive gifts while master storytellers recount the deceased's achievements and family histories spanning generations. The practice requires years of preparation, with families accumulating wealth specifically for these distribution ceremonies that can last for days or even weeks. Mourners compete to give away the most valuable items, sometimes impoverishing themselves to properly honor their dead relatives and maintain family dignity. Communities developed intricate protocols governing gift distribution, with specific items designated for different social ranks and relationship categories. Canadian authorities later banned potlatches as economically destructive, forcing Tlingit families to hold secret ceremonies in remote locations while maintaining their traditional wealth redistribution systems through underground networks. What ancient generosity flows through those cedar halls where grief transforms into giving? You're walking through snowy Bulgarian villages where communities create the most terrifying funeral masks ever crafted, wearing elaborate costumes designed to scare malevolent spirits away from funeral processions and protect mourning families. These kukeri performers, dressed in fearsome animal pelts and carved wooden masks with horns, bells, and mirrors, lead funeral processions while making loud noises and performing intimidating dances. Picture masked figures leaping and stamping through village streets while bells sewn to their costumes create cacophonous soundscapes that drive away evil entities seeking to harm vulnerable, grieving souls. The practice requires master craftsmen who carve protective masks and specialized tailors who create elaborate costumes from wolf, bear, and goat hides collected during specific seasonal hunts. Mourners follow behind these protective performers, believing the kukeri's frightening appearance and loud noises create safe corridors through which funeral processions can pass without spiritual interference. Communities maintain collections of ancient masks and costumes passed down through generations, with some pieces believed to possess accumulated protective power from decades of funeral service. Modern Bulgarian villages continue these traditions, though many urban families now hire professional kukeri performers rather than maintaining family costume collections. What ancient protection clangs in those bronze bells? driving darkness from the paths of grief. Dear listeners, breathe deeply as you enter colorful Ghanaian workshops where master craftsmen create the world's most imaginative coffins, shaped like airplanes, fish, cars, and other objects that celebrate the deceased's passions, professions, and dreams. These elaborate abebu adekai, or fantasy coffins, transform funeral preparations into artistic celebrations where death becomes an opportunity for creative expression and personal storytelling. You're witnessing families collaborating with skilled carpenters to design custom coffins that reflect their loved one's personality, from giant cell phones for communication enthusiasts to elaborate boats for fishermen and colorful birds for those who dreamed of flight. The practice requires master woodworkers who combine traditional carpentry skills with innovative artistic vision, creating functional sculptures that serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Mourners spend months planning these custom coffins, discussing design details and gathering photographs and personal items that inspire the craftsman's creative process. Communities compete to commission the most spectacular fantasy coffins, with some families saving for years to afford elaborate custom designs that become neighborhood talking points. International art collectors now purchase these coffins as sculptures, creating unexpected economic opportunities for traditional Ghanaian craftsmen who never intended their funeral art for gallery display. What joyous creativity flows through those colorful coffins, celebrating life's unique beauty even in death. You're riding across endless Mongolian steppes where nomadic herders practice one of the world's most elemental funeral customs, placing their deceased on elevated wooden platforms where vultures and eagles carry their souls skyward through consumption of their earthly bodies. These traditional sky burials reflect deep Buddhist beliefs about the temporary nature of physical form and the importance of giving back to the natural world that sustained life. Picture families gathering around simple wooden platforms while monks chant prayers that guide souls through their transformation from earthly existence to skyborne liberation. The practice requires careful selection of elevated locations with good visibility for scavenging birds, plus master craftsmen who build platforms strong enough to withstand fierce steppe winds while remaining accessible to aerial scavengers. Mourners maintain these platform sites across generations, creating sacred landscapes where multiple family members return to nourish the endless sky. Communities developed elaborate protocols for platform construction and maintenance, with different designs for children, adults, and revered elders or religious teachers. Modern urban Mongolians often struggle to maintain these traditional practices while living in cities, creating tensions between ancient customs and contemporary lifestyle demands. What endless freedom soars on those steppe winds, carrying souls toward their boundless sky home. Hey friends, imagine rowing through misty Venetian lagoons toward Poveglia Island, where medieval authorities created Europe's most isolated funeral ground during repeated plague outbreaks that killed thousands of residents. This small island became a massive crematorium and burial site, where plague victims were transported by special boats, their bodies burned in enormous pyres that could be seen glowing from the mainland. You're witnessing masked plague doctors overseeing these grim operations, while families watched smoke rising from the island, knowing their loved ones were joining the estimated 160,000 souls already interred in its soil. The practice created unique funeral logistics, with special boats designated exclusively for transporting plague dead and professional body collectors who risked their lives maintaining this deadly supply chain. Mourners were forbidden from visiting the island, creating profound grief complications as families couldn't perform traditional Catholic funeral rites or maintain graveside relationships with their deceased. Communities developed alternative memorial practices, including special masses held in mainland churches and elaborate home altars created for families who couldn't visit actual graves. Legend claims the island's soil remains 50% human ash, creating one of the most densely concentrated burial sites in human history. What ghostly memories drift across those dark lagoon waters, carrying centuries of quarantined grief? You're descending into torch-lit Egyptian tombs, where ancient embalmers practiced the world's most intricate organ preservation ceremonies, carefully removing and storing internal organs in ornate canopic jars, protected by 4 divine guardians. These elaborate mummification rituals required master embalmers who knew precisely which organs to remove, how to preserve them using natron salts and sacred oils, and which protective deities to invoke for each bodily component. Picture families gathering while skilled morticians work with religious precision, chanting protective spells as they place liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines into beautiful limestone or ceramic vessels topped with carved heads representing the 4 sons of Horus. The practice demanded expensive materials, including imported natron, cedar oil, precious resins, and skilled craftsmanship for creating custom canopic sets that could cost entire family fortunes. Mourners participated by providing specific grave goods and maintaining ritual purity during the 70-day mummification process, with wealthy families sometimes hiring professional mourners to maintain proper ceremonial atmosphere. Communities developed thriving industries around mummification supplies, with specialized workshops producing canopic jars, amulets, and bandages for families across different economic levels. Modern archaeological discoveries continue revealing canopic jar collections, though many were destroyed by early excavators who valued only golden artifacts. What eternal guardianship flows through those sacred vessels, protecting souls piece by precious piece, dear listeners. Settle into this sensitive story from pre-colonial Fiji, where certain warrior communities practiced the most controversial funeral custom in Pacific history, consuming portions of deceased enemies and honored chiefs in ceremonial feasts that transferred spiritual power between souls. These elaborate Bakola ceremonies involved complex protocols governing who could participate, which body parts held spiritual significance, and how consumption rituals connected the living with the deceased's mana or life force. You're witnessing tribal leaders carefully dividing sacred portions, while shamans chant prayers that ensure proper spiritual transfer from the consumed to the consumer, believing this practice honored worthy opponents and absorbed their courage. The custom required extensive preparation, including special cooking methods, ceremonial utensils, and purification rituals for participants who took on spiritual responsibility for the consumed person's essence. Mourners followed strict taboos governing behavior before and after these ceremonies, with some community members fasting for days to prepare their bodies for receiving spiritual essence through consumption. European missionaries later documented these practices with horror, viewing them as demonic barbarism rather than understanding their complex spiritual and social significance within traditional Fijian worldview. Archaeological evidence suggests the practice was less common than colonial accounts suggested, with most Fijian communities practicing conventional burial methods. What ancient honor flows through those forbidden ceremonies where respect transcended the boundaries of life itself? You're climbing through ancient Kathmandu streets where the most paradoxical funeral custom ever created involves the ritualized death of living goddesses when they reach puberty, transforming divine children back into ordinary mortals through elaborate deification reversal ceremonies. These young Kumari goddesses, believed to be incarnations of the Hindu deity Taleju, must undergo symbolic death rituals when they lose their divine purity, typically marked by their first menstruation or accidental injury that causes bleeding. Picture elaborate processions where former goddesses are carried through temple courtyards, while priests perform complex rituals that formally separate divine consciousness from human bodies, allowing these girls to return to normal family life. The practice requires master priests who understand the intricate theological protocols for managing divine transitions, plus communities willing to support former goddesses who often struggle to adapt to ordinary social expectations after years of worship. Mourners participate by offering prayers and gifts that ease these transitions, while families grapple with daughters who must learn basic social skills after years of divine isolation. Communities maintain support systems for former Kumaris, though many face challenges finding marriage partners willing to wed former goddesses who carry complex spiritual associations. Modern human rights activists question these traditions, creating tensions between cultural preservation and child welfare concerns. What divine mysteries surround these living deaths, where godhood itself becomes mortal memory? You're standing in revolutionary Paris, where radical philosophers created the most atheistic funeral ceremonies in European history, replacing Catholic masses with elaborate celebrations of human reason and natural philosophy. The cult of reason transformed Notre Dame into a temple where deceased revolutionaries received funeral honors that celebrated scientific achievement rather than divine salvation. Picture mourners dressed in classical robes gathering around altars decorated with geometric symbols, while actors portraying liberty and reason performed ceremonial dances that honored the deceased's contributions to human progress. The practice required professional choreographers and set designers who created elaborate theatrical productions that transformed death into educational entertainment about Enlightenment values. Families commissioned composers to write funeral marches based on mathematical principles rather than religious themes, creating soundtracks that celebrated rational thought over spiritual transcendence. Communities competed to host the most intellectually sophisticated memorial ceremonies, with some families hiring philosophers to deliver eulogies that connected their loved ones' lives to broader themes of social progress. Napoleon eventually banned these ceremonies as politically dangerous, forcing surviving revolutionaries to maintain secret reason-based funeral networks. What revolutionary songs still echo through those transformed cathedrals, celebrating humanity's rational triumph over death? Dear listeners, breathe deeply as you enter the heart of Tenochtitlan, where Aztec warriors practiced the most spiritually complex funeral custom ever devised, capturing enemy soldiers in ritual combat specifically to provide divine sacrifices for deceased nobles and priests. These Xochimequistli, or flower wars, created elaborate death ceremonies where captured warriors were sacrificed to nourish the souls of important Aztec dead, ensuring their successful journey through the underworld's 9 levels. You're witnessing elaborate processionals where families of the deceased lead captive warriors to pyramid temples while priests chant prayers that transform death into divine sustenance. The practice required master warriors trained in capture techniques that left enemies alive for ceremonial purposes, plus priests skilled in complex theological protocols governing human sacrifice timing and methods. Mourners participated by providing elaborate costumes and jewelry for both the deceased and their sacrificial companions, believing proper ornamentation ensured divine recognition in the afterlife. Communities developed sophisticated military and religious systems that coordinated flower wars with funeral needs, creating calendars that balanced warfare, agriculture, and death ceremonies. Spanish conquistadors completely destroyed these practices, viewing them as demonic rather than understanding their intricate spiritual and social significance. What sacred flowers bloom eternal in those ancient ceremonies, where death became divine nourishment? Hey friends, imagine traveling to the Arctic tundra, where Sami reindeer herders practice one of the world's most musical funeral customs, burying their deceased shamans with sacred drums, believed to guide souls through complex spirit world geography. These traditional rune bomb burial ceremonies involve entire communities gathering to hear final drum performances that map the deceased shaman's intended route through supernatural landscapes populated by ancestral spirits and guardian entities. Picture families seated around flickering fires while master drummers play intricate rhythms that correspond to specific spiritual territories, believing these final concerts provide navigation instructions for souls beginning their eternal journeys. The practice requires drums crafted from specific materials including reindeer hide, birch wood, and metal rings, forged during particular seasonal ceremonies, with each instrument containing unique symbolic paintings that represent individual spiritual maps. Mourners maintain absolute silence during drum burial preparations, believing spoken words could interfere with the delicate spiritual instructions being encoded in the instrument's final performance. Communities pass these sacred drums through hereditary lines, with some families maintaining drum collections spanning multiple generations of shamanic practitioners. Christian missionaries later destroyed most Sami drums as pagan artifacts, forcing practitioners to hide remaining instruments in remote tundra locations. What eternal rhythms pulse through those frozen landscapes, drumming souls toward their spirit world homes? You're climbing steep Indonesian cliffs where Torajan communities create the world's most vertically ambitious cemeteries, hanging elaborately carved wooden coffins from rocky precipices that overlook rice terraces and village life below. These liang burial sites transform death into permanent community membership, with deceased family members literally overseeing their living relatives from elevated positions that command spectacular mountain views. Picture master carpenters spending months creating custom coffins shaped like traditional houses, complete with miniature roofs, windows, and decorative carvings that reflect the deceased's social status and family achievements. The practice requires skilled climbers who can safely install heavy wooden coffins in precarious cliff locations, using traditional rope and pulley systems passed down through generations. Mourners gather below these hanging cemeteries during anniversary ceremonies, sharing meals and family news while communicating with their elevated ancestors through prayers and offerings carried upward by mountain winds. Communities maintain these cliff burial sites across centuries, creating aerial villages where multiple generations of families create permanent settlements in death. Modern tourism has brought international attention to these practices, creating both economic opportunities and cultural preservation challenges for traditional Torajan communities. What ancient conversations drift on mountain winds between those cliff-dwelling ancestors and valley-dwelling descendants? Dear listeners, descend into medieval European ossuaries where communities transformed human bones into the most macabre architectural decorations ever created, arranging skulls and femurs into elaborate wall patterns that reminded visitors of death's inevitable democracy. These charnel houses served both practical and spiritual purposes, providing space-efficient storage for remains while creating contemplative environments where living visitors could meditate on mortality and prepare their souls for judgment. You're walking through chambers where thousands of bones create intricate geometric patterns, while oil lamps flicker against hollow eye sockets that seem to watch your every movement with ancient wisdom. The practice required specialized bone arrangers who understood both artistic principles and theological symbolism, creating displays that transformed death into teaching tools about Christian salvation and moral behavior. Mourners visited these ossuaries during religious holidays, praying among bone walls while seeking intercession from the anonymous dead who surrendered their individual identities to create collective monuments to human mortality. Communities developed elaborate protocols for bone selection and arrangement, with some ossuaries featuring special alcoves for skulls of particular saints or community leaders. Protestant reformers later condemned these displays as superstitious, leading to destruction of many medieval charnel houses across northern Europe. What silent sermons echo from those bone-built walls, teaching eternity through architecture of mortality? You're entering remote Australian Aboriginal communities where the most profound funeral silence in human history transforms entire cultures through sorry business, comprehensive mourning protocols that honor the deceased by never speaking their names again. These elaborate grief customs involve communities observing extended periods of silence, temporary abandonment of burial locations, and permanent retirement of the deceased's personal names from daily vocabulary. Picture entire settlements moving to new locations while families burn personal possessions and destroy photographs, believing these actions help deceased souls complete their journey to ancestral dreaming without earthly attachments holding them back. The practice requires communities to maintain alternative vocabularies and place names, with some groups developing entirely new linguistic systems to replace words associated with recently deceased members. Mourners paint themselves with traditional ochre designs while maintaining strict behavioral restrictions that can last for months or years depending on the deceased's cultural significance and family relationships. Different Aboriginal groups developed unique sorry business protocols, with some communities restricting certain activities, foods, or locations until proper spiritual clearance ceremonies restore normal social functioning. Anthropologists struggle to document these practices respectfully, since academic inquiry often violated the very silence and secrecy that made sorry business spiritually effective. What sacred silence holds those ancient landscapes, where names become offerings to eternal dreaming? Hey friends, step into ancient Roman homes during the haunting nights of Lemuria, when families performed the most systematic ghost appeasement ceremonies in classical history, throwing black beans over their shoulders while chanting protective spells to pacify restless spirits of improperly buried dead. These three-night festivals, held every May, transformed Roman households into supernatural battlegrounds where living family members confronted potentially dangerous spirits who might harm their descendants if not properly honored. You're witnessing paterfamilias figures walking barefoot through darkened houses at midnight, making specific gestures and recitations while tossing beans that spirits supposedly gathered as payment for leaving the living undisturbed. The practice required precise ritual knowledge, including specific Latin phrases, timing requirements, and material offerings that varied depending on the nature of the spiritual threat being addressed. Roman families maintained detailed records of deceased relatives who might return as lemurs, creating genealogical databases designed to prevent accidental spiritual offense through forgotten names or incomplete ceremonies. Communities developed professional exorcists who specialized in complex Lemuria rituals for wealthy families dealing with particularly persistent or dangerous ghost activity. Early Christians later adapted some Lemuria elements into All Saints observances, transforming pagan ghost appeasement into Christian saint veneration. What midnight whispers still echo through those Roman corridors, where beings bought peace with the restless dead? You're climbing toward remote Tibetan monasteries, where Buddhist practitioners perfect the most sophisticated death preparation techniques ever developed, training for decades to consciously transfer their awareness out of dying bodies through specific meditation practices called Fowa. These elaborate consciousness ejection exercises involve monks spending years learning to project their awareness through crown chakras while maintaining clear mental focus during the dying process. Picture meditation halls where practitioners spend hours visualizing complex deity forms and energy channels while master teachers guide them through increasingly advanced consciousness manipulation techniques. The practice requires intensive study of Tibetan Book of the Dead instructions, plus personal mentorship from realized masters who successfully demonstrated Fowa abilities during their own death experiences. Mourners gather around dying practitioners to witness these consciousness transfer attempts, sometimes observing physical signs like warm spots on crown areas or specific body postures that indicate successful awareness ejection. Communities maintain detailed records of practitioners who achieved various levels of Fowa mastery, creating spiritual genealogies that track consciousness transfer abilities across generations. Some Western researchers have attempted to study Fowa phenomena scientifically, though traditional practitioners argue that materialistic approaches fundamentally misunderstand the spiritual dimensions of consciousness transfer techniques. What luminous awareness rises through those mountain meditation halls, transcending death through mastery of mind? Dear listeners, journey into Papua New Guinea highlands, where tribal communities practice the most smoke-intensive mummification process ever developed, slowly preserving deceased warriors and chiefs in special huts where constant fires create natural preservation conditions. These elaborate smoking ceremonies involve families maintaining continuous fires for months, while gradually dehydrating bodies through controlled heat and smoke exposure that prevents decay while maintaining recognizable human features. You're witnessing village communities taking turns feeding sacred fires with specific wood types, while family members tend to body positioning and oil treatments that enhance the natural mummification process. The practice requires master firekeepers who understand precise temperature and humidity control necessary for successful preservation, plus traditional healers who know which plant oils and treatments optimize the smoking process. Mourners maintain these smoking huts across generations, creating sacred spaces where perfectly preserved ancestors continue participating in community life through periodic ceremonies and consultations. Communities developed elaborate protocols governing access to mummified ancestors, with different preservation techniques designated for warriors, healers, chiefs, and other social categories. Modern Papua New Guinea governments have sometimes restricted these practices due to health concerns, though remote highland communities often continue traditional mummification in secret locations. What ancient smoke still rises from those sacred huts, preserving warriors for eternal community service? You're descending into Ethiopia's remarkable rock-hewn churches, where medieval communities created the most architecturally ambitious burial sites in Christian history, carving elaborate underground tomb chambers directly from solid volcanic rock. These monolithic churches, centered around Lalibela, serve both as active worship spaces and sacred burial grounds where Ethiopian Orthodox families enter their deceased within walls that required generations of stonemasons to complete. Picture candlelit ceremonies where families lower their loved ones into stone sarcophagi carved centuries ago by master craftsmen who transformed entire hillsides into underground cathedral complexes. The practice required sophisticated engineering knowledge to create proper drainage, ventilation, and structural support for these underground religious communities that function simultaneously as churches and cemeteries. Mourners participate in elaborate funeral liturgies that echo through stone chambers, acoustically designed to enhance chanted prayers and musical performances that guide souls through Orthodox spiritual geography. Communities maintain these rock churches through centuries, with families contributing labor and resources to ongoing maintenance projects that preserve both architectural heritage and active burial traditions. Some burial chambers remain sealed since medieval times, containing remains of saints and rulers whose tombs have become pilgrimage destinations for Orthodox Christians throughout East Africa. What eternal prayers resonate through those stone cathedral depths where worship and burial merge in living rock? Hey friends, settle into this mystical story from Ottoman Turkey, where Sufi communities created the most hypnotic funeral ceremonies in Islamic history, spinning in ecstatic dances that guide deceased souls through their journey toward divine unity. These Mevlevi death rituals involve white-robed dervishes whirling for hours around symbolic tombs, while mourners witness the most beautiful representation of spiritual transcendence ever choreographed. You're watching master dancers achieve trance states that represent the soul's rotation around divine love, their flowing skirts creating perfect circles that mirror celestial movements. The practice requires years of training to master the precise breathing, posture, and spiritual focus necessary to maintain extended spinning without losing consciousness or sacred intention. Mourners participate by maintaining meditative silence while musicians play traditional ney flutes and frame drums that guide the whirling rhythms. Communities built special octagonal halls called semaheni, designed specifically for funeral whirling, with acoustic properties that enhance the mystical atmosphere through sound resonance. Some Ottoman authorities restricted these ceremonies as potentially heretical, forcing Sufi communities to perform secret nighttime whirling rituals in hidden locations throughout Anatolia. What divine ecstasy still spins through those sacred halls, carrying souls toward their eternal beloved? You're standing beside Cambodia's Mekong River during the most beautiful funeral flotilla ever created, where families launch elaborate decorated boats carrying offerings and symbolic representations of their deceased toward ancestral water realms. These traditional Pshom Ben death ceremonies involve entire villages gathering at riverbanks to release hundreds of flower-laden boats while monks chant prayers that guide souls through complex aquatic geography toward their final resting places. Picture families spending weeks creating intricate banana leaf boats decorated with candles, incense, and favorite foods of the deceased, believing these floating offerings provide spiritual sustenance for hungry ghosts seeking peace. The practice requires skilled boat builders who understand both hydrodynamics and spiritual symbolism, creating vessels that float properly while carrying maximum spiritual cargo toward ancestral destinations. Mourners follow these boat launches with 7 days of temple ceremonies where families offer rice balls and prayers to ensure their deceased relatives receive adequate spiritual nourishment during their afterlife journey. Communities coordinate these festivals with monsoon seasons, timing boat launches when river currents best facilitate spiritual transportation toward distant ancestor realms. Modern dam construction has altered traditional river patterns, forcing some communities to adapt ancient boat launching practices to new water conditions. What gentle currents still carry those prayer-laden boats toward realms where ancestors feast eternally? Dear listeners, feel the crisp Arctic air as you discover how Inuit communities created the most patient funeral vigils in human history, maintaining watch through specially constructed ice windows for returning souls of deceased family members. These elaborate winter mourning practices involve families carving clear ice panels into igloo walls while maintaining oil lamp vigils that could last for months, believing deceased relatives would return as spiritual lights visible only through pure ice. You're witnessing entire communities taking turns at ice windows while elders share stories about recognizing different types of soul manifestations that appear as colored lights dancing across frozen landscapes. The practice requires expert ice cutters who can harvest perfectly clear ice blocks and skilled igloo builders who can install window panels without compromising structural integrity of snow shelters. Mourners maintain detailed logs recording apparent soul sightings, with families comparing observations to identify patterns that might indicate successful spiritual communication with their deceased relatives. Communities developed elaborate protocols for ice window maintenance, including techniques for preventing frost buildup and ensuring optimal viewing conditions throughout long Arctic winters. Modern climate change has altered traditional ice conditions, making it increasingly difficult for some communities to maintain these ancient soul-watching practices. What eternal lights still dance across those frozen windows where patience becomes prayer for returning souls? You're walking through perfumed Persian gardens, where medieval Islamic communities transformed cemeteries into the most literary landscapes ever created, planting flower beds arranged to spell out Quranic verses and beloved poetry among ornate marble tombstones. These elaborate Rauda memorial gardens involve families commissioning master calligraphers and landscape architects to create living manuscripts where seasonal blooms reveal different sacred texts throughout the year. Picture mourners strolling paths lined with roses, jasmine, and tulips planted in Arabic script patterns, while fountains provide musical accompaniment to whispered prayers and recited poetry honoring the deceased. The practice requires botanical experts who understand bloom timing for different flower varieties, plus skilled gardeners who can maintain complex plant arrangements that spell out sacred words across changing seasons. Families spend years planning these literary gardens, selecting appropriate verses from classical poetry, religious texts, and original compositions that celebrate their loved ones' spiritual and intellectual achievements. Communities compete to create the most sophisticated garden poetry, with some cemeteries becoming famous throughout the Islamic world for their innovative combination of horticulture and literature. Mongol invasions destroyed many of these garden tombs, though some Persian and Central Asian communities secretly maintained smaller versions of these literary burial practices. What fragrant verses still bloom in those sacred gardens where flowers become prayers and beauty honors the departed? Hey friends, dim the lights as you enter Indonesian villages where Javanese communities practice the most theatrical funeral custom ever performed, staging elaborate shadow puppet shows that tell the deceased's life story while guiding their soul through complex mythological journeys. These wayang kulit death ceremonies involve master puppeteers performing all-night shows behind illuminated screens while families gather to witness their loved one's spiritual transformation into legendary characters from Hindu epics. You're watching intricate leather puppets cast dancing shadows on white cloth screens, while gamelan orchestras provide hypnotic musical accompaniment that carries souls through supernatural adventures toward their final resting places. The practice requires puppeteers who have memorized thousands of traditional stories, plus the ability to improvise personalized narratives that incorporate the deceased's actual life experiences into mythological frameworks. Mourners participate by requesting specific story elements that honor their family member's personality, profession, or spiritual achievements, creating unique funeral performances that celebrate individual lives within eternal storytelling traditions. Communities maintain collections of antique puppets and musical instruments passed down through generations, with some shadow puppet sets believed to possess supernatural power accumulated through decades of funeral performances. Modern Indonesian families sometimes hire professional wayang troupes for urban funeral ceremonies, adapting ancient village traditions to contemporary settings. What eternal shadows still dance on those sacred screens, where every life becomes legend through the art of storytelling. You're climbing North African Atlas Mountains, where Berber communities created the most vertically ambitious funeral monuments in Islamic history, constructing tall stone towers that elevate their deceased toward celestial realms while serving as permanent landmarks for nomadic tribes. These Imzad burial towers involve entire clans gathering stones for months, while master masons build tapering structures that can reach 40 feet in height, creating desert lighthouses that guide both souls and travelers across vast landscapes. Picture families camping around construction sites while musicians play traditional melodies on single-string violins that honor both the deceased and the collective labor required for tower building. The practice requires sophisticated engineering knowledge to create stable, tall structures using only local stone and traditional mortar techniques, plus artistic skills for carving geometric patterns and Arabic calligraphy into tower surfaces. Mourners contribute different types of labor to tower construction, with elders supervising design, adults hauling materials, and children gathering smaller stones that fill interior spaces of these permanent memorials. Communities develop networks of related towers across mountain ranges, creating navigational systems that connect scattered Berber settlements while honoring deceased family members who become eternal waypoints for their descendants. Modern borders and sedentary lifestyles have reduced some tribes' ability to maintain these traditional tower-building practices across multiple countries. What ancient guidance rises from those stone towers, marking paths between earth and sky for both souls and travelers? Dear listeners, look upward as you discover how Philippine mountain tribes create the most elevated cemeteries in Southeast Asia, hanging elaborately carved wooden coffins from sheer cliff faces where ancestors maintain eternal watch over their descendants' valley communities. These Igorot burial practices involve master woodcarvers, spending months creating hollow tree trunk coffins, while families gather materials for the dangerous installation process that requires skilled rock climbers and traditional rope systems. You're witnessing entire villages cooperating to raise heavy wooden coffins up vertical cliff faces using bamboo scaffolding and woven rattan ropes, while shamans perform ceremonies that ensure proper spiritual elevation for the deceased. The practice requires careful site selection based on both geological stability and spiritual significance, with families choosing cliff locations that provide optimal views of rice terraces and village activities below. Mourners maintain these hanging cemeteries through generations, with periodic ceremonies that involve lowering rope ladders to access coffin sites for maintenance and offerings to ancestral spirits. Communities develop elaborate taboos governing access to these sacred cliffs, with only certain family members permitted to approach hanging coffin installations during specific ceremonial periods. Modern tourism has brought international attention to these practices, creating both economic opportunities and cultural preservation challenges for traditional mountain communities. What eternal conversations drift between those cliff-dwelling ancestors and their valley descendants below? You're entering remote Russian forests, where Old Believer communities practice the most controversial funeral custom in Orthodox history, choosing collective self-immolation rather than accepting religious reforms they viewed as heretical corruptions of true Christian faith. These gari burning ceremonies involved entire families gathering in wooden buildings specifically constructed for group immolation, while priests led final prayers and hymns that transformed death into martyrdom for traditional Orthodox practices. Picture communities spending months in spiritual preparation through intensive fasting, confession, and prayer while constructing special wooden structures designed to burn quickly and completely during their final testimony to religious conviction. The practice required careful theological preparation to ensure participants understood the spiritual significance of choosing martyrdom over compromise with Reformed church practices they considered satanic innovations. Mourners from neighboring communities sometimes gathered at safe distances to witness these burning ceremonies while maintaining their own commitment to traditional religious practices despite government persecution. Old Believer leaders developed elaborate theological justifications for self-immolation, viewing these deaths as purification through fire that preserved souls from contamination by Reformed religious practices. Surist authorities eventually suppressed these practices through military intervention, though some remote Old Believer communities continued secret burning ceremonies well into the modern era. What sacred flames still burn in those ancient forests, where conviction became the ultimate funeral pyre? Hey friends, feel the ocean breeze as you step onto ancient Polynesian ceremonial platforms, where island communities created the most architecturally sophisticated funeral monuments in Pacific history, interring their deceased within massive stone foundations that support ongoing religious and social activities. These elaborate marae burial sites involve entire islands cooperating to transport and arrange multi-ton basalt stones into precise geometric patterns, while master builders create temple platforms that serve simultaneously as burial grounds and community gathering spaces. You're witnessing families participating in complex construction projects that can span generations, with each stone placement requiring ceremonial protocols that honor both ancestral spirits and architectural precision necessary for stable platform construction. The practice requires sophisticated engineering knowledge to create level surfaces using irregular stones, plus deep understanding of spiritual geography that determines proper orientation and proportional relationships between different platform elements. Mourners maintain these sacred platforms through centuries of continuous use, with families contributing labor and materials for ongoing repairs while participating in ceremonies that connect living communities with buried ancestors beneath their feet. Different Pacific Island groups developed unique moray styles, creating architectural diversity that reflects local stone availability, cultural preferences, and specific spiritual beliefs about appropriate relationships between the living and dead. This sentence is implicitly represented in the previous prompt. No new visual prompt needed. What eternal strength flows through those ancient stone foundations, supporting both temples and the sacred weight of memory? You're entering Byzantine monasteries where Orthodox communities developed the most artistic funeral custom in Christian history, commissioning sacred icons that incorporated actual remains of deceased saints and martyrs into painted surfaces using traditional egg tempera and ground bone techniques. These elaborate relic icons involve master painters working with monastery communities to create sacred images where physical remains of holy individuals become literal components of devotional artwork displayed in churches throughout the Orthodox world. Picture monks carefully preparing pigments that include powdered bone fragments, while icon painters apply these sacred materials using traditional techniques that transform death into permanent windows between earthly and heavenly realms. The practice requires expert knowledge of both artistic techniques and theological principles governing proper treatment of holy relics, plus specialized preservation methods that protect bone fragments incorporated into painted surfaces. Mourners venerate these relic icons during liturgical services, believing proximity to actual remains enhances their prayers and provides direct spiritual connection with deceased saints who continue serving as intermediaries between human communities and divine presence. Communities maintain detailed records documenting which relics are incorporated into specific icons, creating theological databases that track the spiritual history and miraculous powers attributed to different sacred images. Iconoclastic periods led to destruction of many relic icons, though some survived in hidden monastery collections. What holy presence still glows through those sacred pigments, where art and sanctity merge in eternal devotion? You're galloping across ancient Ukrainian steppes, where nomadic Scythian warriors created the most magnificent equestrian funeral ceremonies ever recorded, burying their chiefs with entire herds of sacrificed horses arranged in elaborate underground chambers. These massive Kurgan burial mounds involve hundreds of community members working for months to excavate enormous pits, while master craftsmen prepare golden bridles, saddles, and weapons that transform death into eternal cavalry charges. Picture families leading processions of decorated horses, while shamans chant prayers that ensure proper spiritual transportation across otherworldly landscapes where ancestors continue their nomadic lifestyle forever. The practice requires sophisticated preservation techniques using felt, leather, and permafrost conditions that naturally mummify both human and equine remains for thousands of years. Mourners participate by contributing their finest horses to these funeral herds, believing generous offerings ensure the deceased's status in spiritual realms where riding skill determines social hierarchy among warrior ancestors. Communities compete to organize the most spectacular horse burial ceremonies, with some chiefs interred alongside 50 or more horses arranged in perfect formation around underground burial chambers. Modern archaeological discoveries continue revealing these frozen time capsules, perfectly preserving Scythian funeral artistry beneath Siberian permafrost. What thunderous hoofbeats still echo across those endless steps, carrying souls toward their nomadic eternity? Dear listeners, breathe the thin mountain air as you ascend sacred Andean peaks, where Inca communities practiced the most elevated funeral ceremonies in human history, offering specially chosen children to mountain deities at altitudes above 20,000 feet. These elaborate capacocha rituals involve year-long preparations where selected children travel throughout the empire as divine messengers before their final transformation into eternal mountain guardians who protect their communities from natural disasters. You're witnessing entire villages gathering to honor these sacred children with feasts, ceremonies, and precious offerings, including gold figurines, textiles, and coca leaves that accompany them to their celestial thrones. The practice requires master priests trained in high-altitude survival techniques, plus expert guides who can navigate treacherous mountain paths while carrying elaborate ceremonial equipment to extreme elevations. Families consider selection for capacocha the highest spiritual honor possible, believing their children become powerful intermediaries between human communities and divine mountain spirits who control weather, earthquakes, and agricultural fertility. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing perfectly preserved child mummies at impossible altitudes, surrounded by treasure offerings that demonstrate the profound reverence these ceremonies commanded throughout the Inca Empire. What eternal prayers rise from those silent peaks where young souls became mountain deities? Hey friends, step into medieval European towns where communities created the most democratic funeral custom in Christian history, staging elaborate danse macabre processions where death personally escorts people from every social class toward their inevitable destiny. These haunting pageants involve entire populations participating in choreographed dances, led by costumed death figures, while musicians play melodies that transform fear into acceptance of mortality's universal democracy. Picture merchants, nobles, peasants, and clergy all following death's lead through cobblestone streets, while spectators witness powerful reminders that earthly status means nothing in the face of eternal judgment. The practice requires skilled costume makers who create elaborate death masks and robes, plus choreographers who design movements that represent different social classes surrendering their worldly pretensions to death's equalizing power. Mourners participate by joining these processions during funeral seasons, finding comfort in shared acknowledgement of mortality while celebrating the spiritual democracy that makes all humans equal before God. Communities commission artists to paint permanent danse macabre murals on church walls, creating visual reminders of death's democracy that survive long after the living dancers join their painted predecessors. Some Protestant regions later banned these processions as superstitious, though the artistic tradition continued influencing European funeral customs for centuries. What ancient steps still guide those mortal dances where kings and commoners follow death's democratic choreography? You're standing on tropical beaches where Solomon Islander communities practice the most dangerous funeral custom in Pacific history, calling sacred sharks to consume their deceased chiefs through ancient songs and traditional offerings that transform death into divine consumption. These elaborate Ramo ceremonies involve master shark callers using secret melodies and specific ritual objects to summon ancestral shark spirits who carry deceased souls to underwater realms where ancestors continue ruling their spiritual territories. Picture entire villages gathering at reef edges while specialized priests perform complex chants that call forth massive sharks who approach without aggression, seemingly understanding their sacred role in these funeral transformations. The practice requires hereditary knowledge passed down through family lines of shark callers who understand both marine behavior and spiritual protocols governing these dangerous yet sacred encounters between humans and their totem predators. Mourners maintain absolute silence during shark calling, believing spoken words could interfere with delicate spiritual communication between living priests and ancestral shark spirits who decide whether to accept each deceased soul. Communities develop elaborate taboos governing interactions with sharks outside funeral contexts, treating these predators as sacred ancestors rather than dangerous animals. Modern conservation efforts sometimes conflict with traditional shark calling practices, creating tensions between environmental protection and cultural preservation. What ancient songs still call across those coral waters, summoning sacred guardians to carry souls home? Dear listeners, enter the heart of Tenochtitlan, where Aztec warriors practiced the most spiritually complex funeral custom in Mesoamerican history, capturing enemy soldiers through ritual flower wars, specifically to provide divine companions for deceased nobles and priests. These elaborate Xochimilquistli ceremonies involve master warriors trained in capture techniques that preserve enemies for subsequent sacrificial transformation into spiritual servants who accompany important Aztec dead through the underworld's treacherous journey. You're witnessing elaborate processions where families of the deceased lead captive warriors to pyramid temples, while priests chant prayers that transform death into divine sustenance for both the departed soul and hungry gods who govern afterlife realms. The practice requires sophisticated military and religious coordination between warrior societies and priestly orders who maintain complex theological understanding of human sacrifice's role in cosmic balance and spiritual transportation systems. Mourners participate by providing elaborate costumes and jewelry for both deceased family members and their sacrificial companions, believing proper ornamentation ensures divine recognition and acceptance in celestial realms. Communities develop intricate calendrical systems that coordinate flower wars with funeral needs, creating military campaigns designed primarily for religious rather than territorial purposes. Spanish conquistadors completely destroyed documentation of these practices, viewing them as demonic rather than understanding their profound spiritual significance. What sacred flowers still bloom in those ancient ceremonies where death became divine nourishment? You're traveling across endless Siberian tundra, where nomadic Evenk herders practice the most mobile funeral custom ever developed, leading deceased family members on final reindeer journeys that mirror their soul's migration toward ancestral hunting grounds in spiritual realms beyond the northern horizon. These traditional Omireng death ceremonies involve entire clans participating in elaborate funeral processions that can span hundreds of miles across frozen landscapes, while shamans perform rituals that ensure proper spiritual navigation through supernatural tundra populated by ancestral spirits. Picture families loading their deceased onto specially decorated reindeer sledges, while master herders select the strongest animals capable of carrying spiritual cargo across both earthly and otherworldly terrains during these sacred migration ceremonies. The practice requires deep knowledge of seasonal migration routes, weather patterns, and spiritual geography that connects physical landscapes with supernatural territories, where Evenk ancestors continue their eternal hunting lifestyle. Mourners participate by contributing their finest reindeer to funeral processions, believing generous offerings demonstrate proper respect for deceased family members who need adequate spiritual transportation to reach their final hunting grounds. Communities maintain detailed oral maps describing routes between earthly and spiritual territories, with some shamans specializing in funeral navigation techniques passed down through generations of reindeer herders. Soviet collectivization policies severely disrupted these traditional funeral migrations, though some remote Evank communities secretly maintained abbreviated versions. What ancient trails still wind across those frozen spaces where reindeer carry souls toward their eternal herds? Hey friends, wade into sacred Ethiopian waters where Orthodox communities practice the most purifying funeral custom in African Christianity, blessing their deceased through elaborate river ceremonies that mirror Christ's baptism while ensuring spiritual cleansing before heavenly judgment. These Timkat death rituals involve entire parishes gathering at blessed waterways, while priests perform complex liturgies that transform funeral preparations into sacramental celebrations of spiritual rebirth through death's sacred waters. You're witnessing families carrying their loved ones to riverbanks decorated with colorful religious banners, while deacons chant ancient Ge'ez hymns that guide souls through baptismal transformation from earthly existence to heavenly citizenship. The practice requires master priests trained in complex Orthodox theology, plus specialized knowledge of hydrological conditions that ensure safe ceremonial access to sacred waters during different seasonal periods throughout the Ethiopian religious calendar. Mourners participate by wearing traditional white clothing while carrying blessed crosses and religious icons that sanctify the funeral procession and provide spiritual protection during these water blessing ceremonies. Communities maintain multiple sacred water sites throughout their territories, with different rivers and springs designated for specific types of funeral blessings based on traditional associations with particular saints or miraculous events. Modern dam construction and pollution have affected some traditional Timkat sites, forcing communities to adapt ancient water blessing practices to new environmental conditions. What holy currents still flow through those blessed waters where souls receive their final baptism into eternal life? You're riding across vast Mongolian grasslands, where nomadic herders created the most elemental funeral custom in Central Asian Buddhism, placing their deceased on elevated wooden platforms where eagles and vultures carry souls skyward through consumption of earthly bodies. These traditional koshu ceremonies involve families constructing simple wooden scaffolds, while lamas perform prayers that guide deceased spirits through their transformation from physical form to skyborne liberation in the endless blue heaven above the steppes. Picture mourners gathering around platform sites, while mounted horsemen maintain respectful distances as large birds arrive to perform their sacred role in these natural cremation ceremonies that require no fuel except the generosity of scavenging wildlife. The practice requires careful selection of elevated locations with optimal visibility for aerial scavengers, plus traditional engineering knowledge for building platforms stable enough to withstand fierce steppe winds while remaining accessible to sky burial's feathered participants. Families maintain these platform sites across generations, creating sacred landscapes where multiple relatives return to nourish the boundless sky that Mongolians consider the ultimate expression of eternal freedom and spiritual liberation. Communities develop elaborate protocols governing platform construction, maintenance, and ceremonial approach procedures that demonstrate proper respect for both deceased humans and living scavengers who participate in these sky burial transformations. Modern urban lifestyles have made traditional sky burial increasingly difficult for Mongolian families living in cities. What boundless freedom soars on those steppe winds where souls join the eternal dance of earth and sky? Dear listeners, feel the warm desert sand as you discover how ancient Nubian kingdoms practiced the most naturally preserving funeral custom in African history, burying their deceased in specially selected sand dunes, where natural desiccation creates perfect mummification conditions without artificial preservation techniques. These elaborate taharka burial ceremonies involve royal families and skilled desert guides collaborating to identify optimal sand locations, where mineral content, drainage patterns, and temperature fluctuations combine to create natural mummification chambers that preserve bodies for millennia. You're witnessing communities gathering precious grave goods, including gold jewelry, ivory carvings, and elaborate pottery, while priests perform complex rituals that ensure proper spiritual preparation for the deceased's journey through desert afterlife, realms ruled by ancient Nubian deities. The practice requires deep understanding of desert ecology, geological conditions, and seasonal weather patterns that affect sand burial effectiveness, plus master craftsmen who create burial chambers lined with specially treated textiles that enhance natural preservation processes. Mourners participate in elaborate funeral processions across desert landscapes, while musicians play traditional harps and drums that guide souls through supernatural sand dune territories where Nubian ancestors continue their royal lifestyle in spiritual desert kingdoms. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing perfectly preserved Nubian mummies in sand burials, complete with elaborate grave goods that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of natural preservation techniques. Many burial sites remain hidden beneath shifting desert sands. What ancient whispers drift across those sacred dunes where desert winds preserve souls in sand's eternal embrace? You're standing at the edge of the world where Patagonian Tehuelche peoples practice the most wind-dependent funeral custom ever recorded, timing their death ceremonies with specific weather patterns that carry deceased souls across vast southern landscapes toward ancestral territories at the continent's edge. These traditional Shan ceremonies involve master weather readers who understand complex atmospheric conditions while families prepare elaborate funeral offerings that must be released during precise wind events that occur only during certain seasonal transitions. Picture nomadic communities waiting patiently for days or weeks until proper wind conditions arrive, then quickly assembling for funeral ceremonies where deceased family members are positioned to catch powerful Patagonian gales that carry souls toward southern aurora displays where ancestors dance in eternal celebration. The practice requires deep meteorological knowledge passed down through generations of wind readers who can predict optimal ceremonial timing based on cloud formations, temperature changes, and atmospheric pressure variations that influence wind direction and spiritual effectiveness. Mourners participate by creating lightweight offerings designed to catch specific wind currents, including feathers, silk scarves, and specially constructed prayer bundles that travel alongside departing souls during their wind-powered journey toward ancestral realms. Communities develop elaborate oral traditions describing wind patterns, seasonal variations, and spiritual geography connecting earthly Patagonia with supernatural southern territories where Tehuelche ancestors continue their nomadic lifestyle. Modern climate change has altered traditional wind patterns affecting some ceremonial timing. What eternal winds still carry those ancient prayers across endless Patagonian spaces toward the dancing lights of ancestral celebration? You're standing in sacred Persian fire temples where Zoroastrian communities practiced the most flame-blessed funeral custom in ancient history, maintaining eternal fires that burn continuously for deceased priests and nobles while their souls journey toward Ahura Mazda's divine light. These elaborate Atash ceremonies involve master firekeepers who tend sacred flames using specific woods and incenses, while families gather in prayer halls decorated with intricate stone carvings that celebrate light's victory over darkness. Picture mourners dressed in white robes, chanting Avestan prayers, while priests add precious sandalwood and frankincense to fires that have burned for centuries, creating aromatic smoke that carries prayers skyward to divine realms. The practice requires hereditary firekeeper families trained in complex rituals governing flame maintenance, fuel selection, and ceremonial timing that ensures proper spiritual guidance for departing souls. Communities contribute valuable materials including rare woods, precious oils, and aromatic resins that sustain these eternal flames while honoring deceased family members through generations of continuous burning. Different temples maintain fires of varying sacred intensity, with some flames burning for over 1,000 years, while serving as spiritual beacons for entire Zoroastrian communities. Arab invasions later destroyed many fire temples, though some communities secretly maintained hidden flames in underground chambers. What eternal light still flickers in those ancient temples where flames became bridges to divine realms? Dear listeners, walk across the Australian outback where Aboriginal communities practice the most geographically comprehensive funeral custom ever created, guiding deceased souls along traditional song lines that map spiritual pathways connecting all sacred sites across the continent. These elaborate Churunga death ceremonies involve elders singing complex song cycles that provide detailed navigation instructions for souls traveling from burial locations to ancestral dreaming sites scattered across thousands of miles of desert and mountain terrain. You're witnessing communities gathering around sacred objects while master songkeepers perform intricate vocal compositions that describe every landmark, water source, and spiritual hazard along the deceased's intended route toward their totemic ancestors' eternal resting place. The practice requires encyclopedic knowledge of tribal geography, seasonal conditions, and spiritual protocols governing access to different sacred sites that serve as waypoints during these posthumous journeys across supernatural landscapes. Mourners participate by contributing their voices to collective singing ceremonies that can last for weeks, with different family members responsible for specific sections of the song cycle that guides their deceased relative through familiar territory toward unknown spiritual destinations. These songline maps represent the world's most sophisticated oral navigation system, encoding tens of thousands of years of geographical and spiritual knowledge in musical form. European colonization severely disrupted many traditional songlines, though some Aboriginal communities continue maintaining these sacred musical maps. What ancient melodies still guide souls across those endless landscapes where every hill and valley holds a sacred song? Hey friends, feel the bitter Siberian wind as you witness Mongolian nomads practicing the most winter-dependent funeral custom in Central Asian history, preserving deceased horsemen with their favorite mounts in natural ice tombs created by Lake Kovsgol's extreme winter conditions. These traditional Morin ceremonies involve entire clans working through brutal winter weather to create elaborate ice burial chambers, where master horsemen and their steeds wait together in frozen suspension until spring ceremonies can transport them to permanent burial grounds. Picture families leading funeral processions across frozen lake surfaces, while shamans perform complex rituals that ensure proper spiritual bonding between deceased riders and their eternal equine companions during these temporary ice preservation periods. The practice requires expert knowledge of ice formation patterns, temperature monitoring, and structural engineering necessary to create stable frozen chambers that protect both human and animal remains from scavengers while maintaining spiritual protocols. Communities coordinate these ice funerals with seasonal migration schedules, timing death ceremonies to coincide with optimal lake freezing conditions that provide adequate preservation until spring transport becomes possible. Different nomadic groups develop unique ice burial techniques based on local climate patterns, with some communities maintaining multiple ice burial sites across their winter territories. Modern climate change has affected traditional ice formation patterns, making some winter burial practices increasingly unreliable. What frozen dreams still rest beneath those crystal waters where riders and horses await their spring awakening? You're kneeling in traditional Japanese gardens where samurai families practiced the most honor-focused funeral custom in military history, transforming ritual suicide into elaborate ceremonies that restore family dignity while ensuring proper spiritual transformation for warriors who choose death over dishonor. These formal seppuku rituals involve master sword craftsmen, ceremonial assistants, and Buddhist priests collaborating to create dignified death ceremonies, where samurai demonstrate ultimate loyalty to their code while achieving spiritual purification through voluntary suffering. Picture cherry blossoms falling like snow, while family witnesses gather in perfect silence as warriors dressed in white robes perform final poems before completing their sacred transformation from dishonored living to honored ancestral spirits. The practice requires years of spiritual preparation, including meditation training, poetry composition, and sword technique mastery that enables participants to maintain perfect composure during their ultimate demonstration of samurai values. Mourners participate through elaborate preparation rituals including garden arrangement, costume selection, and witness positioning that transforms potentially tragic events into beautiful ceremonies celebrating warrior honor and spiritual transcendence. Communities maintain detailed records of seppuku ceremonies, preserving final poems and family testimonies that commemorate these voluntary deaths as examples of proper samurai behavior. The Meiji government later banned seppuku as outdated feudalism, though some families secretly maintained traditional honor-suicide rituals. What eternal honor still blooms in those sacred gardens where warriors chose dignity through death's embrace? Dear listeners, paddle through ancient Lake Texcoco, where Aztec communities created the most agriculturally integrated funeral custom in Mesoamerican history, constructing elaborate floating garden burial sites where deceased nobles nourish crops that feed their living descendants. These magnificent Chinampa death ceremonies involve master agricultural engineers building artificial islands using lake mud, organic matter, and human remains while creating sustainable funeral ecosystems that produce food, flowers, and medicinal plants for generations. You're witnessing families working together to construct floating burial platforms decorated with marigolds and amaranth, while priests perform complex rituals that transform death into agricultural abundance, blessed by Tlaloc, the rain god who governs fertility and harvest cycles. The practice requires sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering, soil composition, and plant biology necessary to create stable floating platforms that support both burial chambers and productive agricultural systems. Communities develop intricate crop rotation schedules that coordinate funeral timing with planting seasons, ensuring optimal integration between death ceremonies and agricultural productivity that sustains entire neighborhoods. Different social classes receive different types of floating garden burials, with elaborate Chinampa complexes reserved for nobles while commoners share smaller collective burial islands. Spanish colonizers destroyed most floating gardens, viewing them as pagan agriculture rather than understanding their profound integration of death, spirituality, and sustainable food production. What eternal harvests still grow from those sacred waters where death became the seed of life? You're walking through Scandinavian forests, where Viking communities practiced the most literary funeral custom in medieval Europe, carving elaborate runestone monuments that preserve detailed stories about deceased warriors, traders, and nobles in permanent stone libraries scattered across the northern landscape. These magnificent runestone commemoration ceremonies involve master stone carvers working with families to create towering granite monuments decorated with intricate runic inscriptions, mythological scenes, and artistic borders that transform death into permanent storytelling. Picture entire communities gathering around newly carved runestones, while skalds recite epic poems that celebrate the deceased's achievements in battle, exploration, and family leadership, while ensuring their stories survive for future generations. The practice requires skilled runic literacy, advanced stone carving techniques, and deep knowledge of Norse mythology necessary to create monuments that properly honor the dead while serving as inspiration for living family members. Families invest enormous resources in runestone creation, commissioning master craftsmen who can work for months creating single monuments while incorporating complex artistic and literary elements that reflect the deceased's social status and personal achievements. Communities maintain these stone libraries across centuries, with runestone sites becoming gathering places for festivals, legal proceedings, and storytelling events that connect living Scandinavians with their ancestral heritage. Many runestones survive today, providing unprecedented insights into Viking funeral practices and social values. What ancient stories still speak from those standing stones where Vikings carved eternity into granite? Hey friends, peer into mysterious Mayan cenotes where ancient communities practiced the most aquatic funeral custom in Central American history, offering deceased priests and nobles to underwater deities through elaborate drowning ceremonies that transform death into divine communication with rain gods dwelling in sacred springs. These profound Chen rituals involve entire city-states gathering at natural limestone sinkholes, while master divers prepare deceased religious leaders with jade jewelry, gold ornaments, and precious offerings before guiding them into underwater realms where Chayak, the rain god, accepts human messengers. You're witnessing torchlit ceremonies where families lower their most revered relatives into crystal-clear waters, while priests chant complex prayers that ensure proper divine reception for souls transitioning from earthly religious service to supernatural diplomatic roles. The practice requires expert knowledge of cenote geography, underwater cave systems, and theological protocols governing communication between human communities and divine water spirits who control rainfall, agricultural fertility, and seasonal flooding. Communities maintain elaborate taboos surrounding cenote access, with most people forbidden from approaching these sacred water sites except during carefully timed funeral ceremonies when divine communication becomes possible. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing perfectly preserved remains in cenote depths, along with elaborate offerings that demonstrate the profound reverence these underwater funeral ceremonies commanded. Some cenotes remain sacred to modern Maya communities who maintain traditional water blessing practices. What divine whispers still echo from those crystal depths where priests became messengers to the rain gods? You're climbing into Carpathian mountain castles, where Romanian communities practiced the most supernatural-focused funeral custom in Eastern European history, maintaining elaborate death vigils designed to prevent deceased family members from transforming into vampires through continuous prayer, garlic offerings, and silver cross protection. These traditional strigoi prevention ceremonies involve entire villages taking turns maintaining 24-hour watches over deceased relatives, while Orthodox priests perform complex exorcism rituals that ensure proper spiritual separation between earthly bodies and potentially dangerous undead spirits. Picture candlelit chambers where mourners arrange elaborate displays of holy water, religious icons, and protective herbs while maintaining constant vigilance for signs of supernatural reanimation that could endanger living community members. The practice requires detailed knowledge of vampire lore, Orthodox theology, and herbal protection techniques passed down through generations of families who live in regions where undead legends remain powerful cultural forces. Communities develop sophisticated watch schedules that ensure continuous supervision while rotating protective duties among extended family networks who share responsibility for preventing supernatural disasters. Some families secretly drive wooden stakes through hearts of suspected potential vampires, though most rely on prayer and protective objects to ensure peaceful transitions to afterlife realms. Modern Romanian families often maintain abbreviated versions of traditional vampire prevention rituals. What ancient protection still guards those mountain vigils where fear transformed into sacred watchfulness? Dear listeners, feel the ocean breeze as you witness Pacific Islander communities practicing the most artistically permanent funeral custom in oceanic history, creating elaborate posthumous tattoos that mark deceased chiefs and warriors with spiritual maps, genealogical records, and protective symbols needed for navigation through supernatural island realms. These sacred tatau death ceremonies involve master tattoo artists working on deceased bodies, while families gather to witness the final artistic transformation that prepares their loved ones for eternal recognition by ancestral spirits who govern afterlife territories scattered across mythical Pacific waters. You're watching communities contribute traditional inks made from candlenut soot and natural pigments, while spiritual experts design complex tattoo patterns that encode family histories, navigation instructions, and protective spells in permanent body art that survives physical death. The practice requires master tattoo artists trained in both artistic techniques and spiritual symbolism, plus detailed knowledge of afterlife geography that determines appropriate designs for different types of souls traveling to various supernatural destinations. Families invest months planning these posthumous tattoo ceremonies, consulting with elders about proper designs while gathering materials needed for creating permanent spiritual documentation. Different island cultures develop unique tattoo styles and spiritual meanings, with some communities specializing in particular types of afterlife navigation tattoos. Colonial missionaries later banned these practices as pagan body modification, though some remote Pacific communities secretly maintained traditional death tattoo ceremonies. What eternal art still marks those island souls with maps for their supernatural voyages home? You're standing in Swiss mountain villages where alpine communities created the most acoustically sophisticated funeral custom in European history, using elaborate church bell systems to announce deaths, guide souls, and coordinate mourning activities across entire mountain valleys through complex bell-ringing codes that carry spiritual messages for miles. These traditional Totenglocken ceremonies involve master bell ringers performing intricate musical sequences that identify the deceased, announce funeral timing, and provide spiritual guidance for departing souls while creating harmonious soundscapes that unite scattered mountain communities in shared mourning experiences. Picture families gathering in village squares while church bells ring specific patterns that honor deceased relatives' social status, age, and spiritual achievements through musical compositions that echo off mountain peaks and carry prayers skyward toward heavenly realms. The practice requires skilled bell ringers, trained in complex musical codes that convey detailed information about funeral arrangements while maintaining spiritual protocols governing different types of death announcements for various community members. Communities develop elaborate bell-ringing traditions that coordinate multiple church towers across valley systems, creating orchestrated funeral music that transforms entire landscapes into resonating chambers for collective grief and spiritual celebration. These bell codes serve practical functions for scattered mountain populations while creating beautiful acoustic monuments that honor the dead through carefully crafted sound compositions. Modern electronic communication has reduced reliance on traditional bell announcement systems. What celestial music still rings across those mountain peaks where bronze bells carried souls toward their eternal rest? You're walking through ancient Indian villages where communities created the most controversial memorial system in Hindu history, erecting elaborate stone monuments to honor wives who chose to join their husbands in death through the practice of sati. These carved sati stones mark locations where women immolated themselves on funeral pyres, believing this ultimate sacrifice ensured eternal unity with their departed spouses. Picture families gathering around these monuments during anniversary ceremonies, offering flowers and incense while seeking blessings for marital happiness and spiritual strength. The practice created complex community responses, with some viewing it as supreme devotion while others questioned its necessity. Mourners developed elaborate rituals around these memorials, including annual festivals where women prayed for spiritual guidance. Communities commissioned skilled stone carvers to create beautiful monuments with intricate designs that celebrated the honored women's sacrifice. British colonial authorities eventually banned the practice, but memorial stones remained as testament to beliefs about love transcending death through ultimate sacrifice. What eternal love stories rest in those weathered stones, speaking across centuries of ultimate devotion. Dear listeners, imagine gathering in cedar longhouses along Alaska's misty coastlines, where Tlingit communities practice the most generous funeral custom ever developed, giving away vast wealth to honor their deceased, while establishing social status through elaborate memorial potlatches. These ceremonies involve families distributing blankets, copper shields, carved artwork, and even slaves to demonstrate love for the departed while securing their position in complex social hierarchies. Picture elaborate feasts where hundreds of guests receive gifts while master storytellers recount the deceased's achievements and family histories spanning generations. The practice requires years of wealth accumulation specifically for these distribution ceremonies that can last days or even weeks. Mourners compete to give away the most valuable items, sometimes impoverishing themselves to properly honor dead relatives and maintain family dignity. Communities develop intricate protocols governing gift distribution, with specific items designated for different social ranks and relationship categories. Canadian authorities later banned potlatches as economically destructive, forcing families to hold secret ceremonies in remote locations. What ancient generosity flows through those cedar halls where grief transforms into the gift of giving. Hey friends, descend into ancient Sumerian burial chambers where royal communities practiced the most hierarchical funeral custom in early civilization, burying kings and queens with entire retinues of servants, musicians, and guards who willingly followed their rulers into death. These elaborate death pits at Ur involve dozens of attendants drinking poison while arranged in ceremonial formations around golden chariots and treasure chambers filled with precious artifacts. You're witnessing the ultimate expression of royal loyalty, where court musicians hold their lyres and soldiers wear their finest armor during these mass burial ceremonies that demonstrate absolute devotion to deceased rulers. The practice requires complex social conditioning that makes voluntary death seem honorable rather than tragic for those chosen to serve their kings and queens in afterlife kingdoms. Communities develop elaborate preparation rituals, including purification ceremonies, farewell feasts, and spiritual instructions before these collective departures. Archaeological discoveries at Ur revealed perfectly preserved evidence of these ceremonies, including musical instruments, jewelry, and ceremonial weapons that accompanied the royal dead and their faithful servants. What loyal songs still echo from those golden chambers where devotion transcended the boundary between life and death. You're traveling across frozen Siberian tundra where indigenous communities practice the most spiritually intensive funeral custom in Arctic shamanism, conducting elaborate soul retrieval ceremonies when family members die far from home or under traumatic circumstances that might scatter their spirits across supernatural landscapes. These complex Udagan rituals involve master shamans entering deep trance states while beating sacred drums that guide their consciousness through otherworldly terrains in search of lost souls who need spiritual rescue and proper guidance toward ancestral territories. Picture entire communities maintaining prayer vigils while shamans perform dangerous soul journeys that can last for days, seeking deceased relatives who might be trapped in supernatural locations between worlds. The practice requires shamans with extraordinary spiritual abilities, plus detailed knowledge of otherworld geography. that maps connections between earthly landscapes and spirit territories. Communities contribute precious offerings, including furs, amber, and sacred objects, to support these dangerous spiritual rescue missions. Some shamans report encountering hostile spirits or becoming lost themselves during these otherworld journeys, requiring other shamans to perform rescue ceremonies for the rescuers. What ancient drums still guide those brave souls who venture into darkness to bring the lost ones home? Dear listeners, walk across the Australian outback where Aboriginal communities practice the most justice-focused funeral custom ever developed, using sacred bone-pointing ceremonies to seek supernatural revenge when family members die under suspicious circumstances that suggest sorcery or social violation. These traditional Kurdicha rituals involve tribal elders performing complex ceremonies with specially prepared kangaroo or emu bones while seeking spiritual justice for the deceased through supernatural means that bypass conventional tribal law. You're witnessing communities gathering in sacred circles while shamans chant in traditional languages, pointing consecrated bones toward suspected wrongdoers who fear supernatural consequences more than earthly punishment. The practice often leads to confessions from guilty parties who believe bone pointing carries deadly spiritual power that can cause illness or death through supernatural justice systems. Mourners maintain absolute silence during bone pointing, believing spoken words could misdirect spiritual energy seeking truth and retribution. Communities develop elaborate protocols for bone preparation, including specific hunting requirements, consecration rituals, and timing restrictions that ensure maximum spiritual effectiveness. What ancient justice flows through those sacred bones, bridging worlds in the eternal search for truth? You're standing in ancient Cambodian forests where Khmer communities created the most aerial funeral custom in Southeast Asian history, constructing elaborate wooden platforms in sacred groves where vultures and eagles consume deceased monks and holy men in ceremonies that transform death into sky-bound spiritual liberation. These Bray ceremonies involve entire monasteries gathering while master builders create elevated platforms using traditional joinery techniques that require no metal fasteners, believing iron contamination could interfere with spiritual ascension processes. Picture saffron-robed monks chanting Pali Sutras, while families offer flowers and incense during these natural cremation ceremonies that require no fire except the sacred flame of spiritual transformation. The practice creates unique funeral ecosystems where death becomes integrated with forest life cycles through generous feeding of aerial scavengers who serve as spiritual messengers. Communities maintain these platform sites across generations, with families contributing labor and materials for ongoing construction while participating in ceremonies that honor deceased spiritual leaders. Different monastery schools develop unique platform designs based on specific Buddhist teachings about death, rebirth, and spiritual liberation through generous offering. What gentle winds still carry prayers skyward from those sacred platforms where flesh became flight toward liberation? Hey friends, enter medieval German villages where communities practice the most spiritually dangerous funeral custom in European Christianity, hiring designated sin-eaters to consume ritual meals placed on corpses, believing this act transfers the deceased's spiritual burdens to living specialists who sacrifice their own salvation for community welfare. These solemn ceremonies involve sin-eaters performing sacred services by eating bread and drinking ale that has absorbed the dead person's sins through contact with their body, ensuring clean passage to afterlife judgment. You're witnessing families gathering around deathbeds while sin-eaters perform ceremonies that combine pagan traditions with Christian beliefs about spiritual cleansing and redemption through sacrificial consumption. The practice creates marginalized yet essential figures who occupy necessary but feared positions in their communities, respected for spiritual service yet avoided for accumulated spiritual contamination. Families pay sin eaters modest fees for these services, creating economic systems around spiritual labor that sustain these specialists through generations. Some sin eaters specialize in particular types of deaths, with different rituals for sudden deaths, long illnesses, or deaths involving unresolved conflicts that require special spiritual intervention. What heavy burdens still weigh on those willing souls who consumed sin to set the departed free? You're stepping onto ancient Pacific ceremonial platforms, where Polynesian communities created the most architecturally ambitious funeral monuments in oceanic history, interring their deceased within massive stone foundations that simultaneously serve as burial grounds and active religious centers. These elaborate marae sites involve entire islands cooperating to transport multi-ton basalt stones, while creating temple platforms that host ongoing ceremonies connecting living communities with buried ancestors beneath their feet. Picture families participating in construction projects spanning generations, with each stone placement requiring ceremonial protocols that honor ancestral spirits while ensuring architectural precision necessary for stable platform construction. The practice requires sophisticated engineering knowledge, plus deep understanding of spiritual geography that determines proper orientation and proportional relationships between different platform elements for optimal supernatural effectiveness. Different Pacific Island groups develop unique marae styles, creating architectural diversity that reflects local stone availability, cultural preferences, and specific spiritual beliefs about appropriate relationships between living and dead. Communities maintain these sacred platforms through centuries of continuous use, with families contributing labor and materials for ongoing repairs while participating in ceremonies that connect them with ancestral spirits. What eternal strength flows through those ancient foundations where temples rest upon the sacred weight of ancestral bones? Dear listeners, descend into Ethiopia's remarkable underground churches, where medieval Orthodox communities created the most architecturally integrated burial system in African Christianity, carving elaborate tomb chambers directly from volcanic rock, while maintaining active worship spaces above these sacred burial grounds. These monolithic churches require generations of stonemasons working with primitive tools to excavate entire cathedral complexes from solid rock while creating burial chambers that serve both practical and spiritual functions. You're witnessing candle-lit ceremonies where families lower their loved ones into stone sarcophagi carved centuries ago by master craftsmen who transformed hillsides into underground religious cities. The practice demands sophisticated engineering to create proper drainage, ventilation, and structural support for underground religious communities functioning as both churches and cemeteries. Communities maintain these rock churches through centuries, with families contributing labor and resources to ongoing maintenance projects that preserve both architectural heritage and active burial traditions. Some burial chambers remain sealed since medieval times, containing remains of saints and rulers whose tombs have become pilgrimage destinations for Orthodox Christians throughout East Africa. What eternal prayers still resonate through those stone cathedral depths where worship and burial merge in living rock? You're standing at the world's edge where Patagonian nomads practice the most meteorologically dependent funeral custom ever recorded, timing death ceremonies with specific wind patterns that carry deceased souls across vast landscapes toward ancestral territories at the continent's southern extremity. These traditional Shan ceremonies involve master weather readers who understand atmospheric conditions, while families prepare funeral offerings that must be released during precise wind events, occurring only during seasonal transitions. Picture communities waiting patiently for days or weeks until proper conditions arrive. then quickly assembling for ceremonies where deceased members are positioned to catch powerful gales that transport souls toward aurora displays where ancestors celebrate eternal freedom. The practice requires deep meteorological knowledge passed through generations of wind readers who predict optimal timing based on cloud formations, temperature changes, and atmospheric pressure variations that influence wind direction and spiritual effectiveness. Mourners participate by creating lightweight offerings designed to catch specific wind currents, including feathers, silk scarves, and specially constructed prayer bundles that travel alongside departing souls during their wind-powered journey toward ancestral realms. Communities develop elaborate oral traditions describing wind patterns, seasonal variations, and spiritual geography connecting earthly Patagonia with supernatural southern territories. What eternal winds still carry ancient prayers across endless spaces toward the dancing lights of ancestral celebration? Hey friends, if these fascinating glimpses into humanity's most creative approaches to honoring the dead are helping you find peaceful rest, don't forget to subscribe for more gentle tales from our shared human story. You're settling into marble Colosseum seats, where Roman families transformed grief into spectacular entertainment, hosting elaborate gladiatorial combats to honor deceased loved ones through the most violent funeral custom in classical history. These munera began as Etruscan blood offerings, but evolved into magnificent spectacles where wealthy families competed to provide the most memorable farewell celebrations for their departed relatives. Picture thousands of spectators cheering while professional fighters risked their lives in sand arenas, believing spilled blood nourished the spirits of the dead and ensured their peaceful passage to the underworld realms. Wealthy Romans spent enormous fortunes on these events, sometimes bankrupting entire estates to surpass rival families' funeral displays through increasingly elaborate gladiatorial performances. Mourners attended these games wearing special mourning attire while vendors sold food and wine, creating festival atmospheres around death ceremonies that demonstrated social status through violent entertainment. Communities developed elaborate protocols for booking gladiators months in advance, while coordinating with arena officials for optimal scheduling of these deadly funeral spectacles. What thunderous applause still echoes in those ancient stones, celebrating lives through mortal combat's deadly grace. Dear listeners, feel the warm tropical air of Bali, where Hindu communities transform cremation into the most joyous death celebration imaginable, building elaborate paper and bamboo animals, palaces, and mythical creatures that burn magnificently while releasing souls from earthly suffering. These spectacular Ngeben ceremonies involve entire villages working together for months to construct artistic cremation towers shaped like dragons, lions, and sacred birds, while gamelan orchestras play hypnotic melodies that guide souls toward moksha liberation from the cycle of rebirth. You're witnessing hundreds of people carrying these ornate cremation structures through narrow village streets, while families dress in white and yellow garments, celebrating rather than mourning their loved one's spiritual freedom from physical constraints. Communities spend years saving money for these spectacular festivals, believing elaborate celebrations ensure proper liberation from rebirth cycles through beautiful ceremonial transformation that honors both the deceased and divine cosmic order. Master craftsmen specialize in building temporary architectural wonders designed to burn magnificently while creating unforgettable spiritual theater that transforms death into celebration. What joyous liberation rises with those sacred flames, carrying souls toward their eternal freedom from earthly bonds. Hey friends, step into the stark Arctic landscapes where Inuit communities created the most naturally preserving funeral chambers imaginable, using sophisticated ice and snow engineering techniques to construct elaborate igloo tombs that maintain deceased family members in frozen perfection throughout long polar winters. These traditional burial igloos involve master builders creating specialized ice architecture, while families carefully arrange personal belongings, hunting equipment, and precious possessions around their preserved relatives during extended winter mourning periods that can last for months. Picture communities gathering in these crystal chambers where aurora borealis lights filter through translucent ice walls, while elders share stories and memories about ancestors whose frozen features remain unchanged by time's passage in these natural refrigeration systems. The practice requires expert knowledge of ice construction techniques, temperature control methods, and seasonal timing that ensures optimal preservation conditions while providing spiritual comfort for grieving families. Different Inuit groups develop unique igloo burial styles based on local ice conditions, family traditions, and specific spiritual beliefs about proper treatment of deceased relatives during Arctic winter months. What frozen dreams rest in those crystal chambers where time stands still and love remains eternally preserved? You're entering remote Sardinian mountain villages where traditional communities practice the most compassionate yet controversial funeral custom in Mediterranean history, employing designated women called akabadora to provide merciful death for suffering elderly family members through gentle suffocation using special wooden hammers called sumatsolu. These deeply secret ceremonies involve families making difficult requests for final kindness when prolonged illness becomes unbearable, believing peaceful assisted death represents ultimate family love rather than cruel abandonment of suffering relatives. Communities maintain strict secrecy around these practices, with akabadora women operating through whispered requests and midnight visits that spare families from witnessing final moments while ensuring dignified deaths for beloved elders. The practice requires specialized knowledge of timing, technique, and spiritual preparation that ensures gentle transitions from suffering to peace while maintaining community solidarity around these mercy killings. These women occupy respected yet feared positions in their villages, honored for providing compassionate service while bearing psychological burdens of ending lives through ritualized suffocation techniques passed down through generations of traditional healers. What gentle mercy still flows through those mountain villages where compassion took the form of final kindness? Dear listeners, sail across endless Pacific waters, where Melanesian island communities practice the most maritime funeral custom in oceanic history, launching deceased chiefs and important family members on elaborate final canoe voyages toward mythical islands where ancestors maintain eternal fishing grounds in supernatural archipelagos. These magnificent water ceremonies involve master canoe builders creating special funeral vessels, while families load provisions, weapons, and personal treasures for supernatural journeys across otherworldly seascapes that connect earthly islands with spiritual territories. You're watching entire communities gathering at sacred beaches while expert navigators perform complex ceremonies that guide soul-carrying canoes toward horizon destinations invisible to living eyes, but clearly mapped in traditional spiritual geography. The practice requires expert knowledge of ocean currents, seasonal weather patterns, and spiritual navigation techniques connecting earthly islands with supernatural archipelagos where ancestral spirits continue their maritime lifestyles through eternal voyaging across celestial waters. Different island cultures develop unique canoe funeral styles based on local woodworking traditions, spiritual beliefs, and specific concepts about proper spiritual transportation for deceased chiefs and family leaders. What ancient currents still carry those sacred vessels toward islands where ancestors fish in eternal waters? You're climbing toward high Tibetan plateaus where Buddhist communities practice the most elementally generous funeral custom imaginable, offering deceased family members to circling vultures in sacred ceremonies that demonstrate ultimate compassion through complete bodily generosity to hungry creatures. These profound Jator rituals involve specialized practitioners called rogyapas, carefully dismantling bodies with traditional knives, while monks chant prayers guiding souls through complex bardos between death and rebirth, in accordance with Tibetan Book of the Dead instructions. Picture families gathering before dawn around sacred burial grounds, while circling vultures patiently await their essential role in this sacred transformation from flesh to flight that embodies Buddhist principles of impermanence and interconnectedness. The practice reflects fundamental Buddhist beliefs about impermanence and compassion, with families believing generous feeding of sky creatures accumulates spiritual merit, while demonstrating proper detachment from physical form that enables spiritual advancement. Communities maintain these sacred burial grounds across generations, creating elevated sites where countless sky burials nourish aerial ecosystems while providing practical solutions for corpse disposal in rocky terrain unsuitable for conventional burial methods. What generous winds still carry prayers upward where flesh becomes flight and compassion feeds the sky. Hey friends, enter medieval European courts where Carolingian nobles practiced the most politically strategic funeral custom in Christian history, dividing royal corpses into multiple parts to create numerous burial sites that spread dynastic influence across kingdoms through sacred body part distribution. These elaborate ceremonies involve families working with master embalmers to separate hearts, bones, and organs while creating ornate golden reliquaries that house different body parts in various cathedral locations throughout their territorial holdings. You're witnessing complex diplomatic logistics, where royal remains become precious political currency, with hearts buried in favorite monasteries, while bones rest in family crypts across different territories to maintain dynastic claims and spiritual authority. The practice requires master embalmers skilled in preservation techniques, talented metalworkers capable of creating beautiful reliquaries, and careful diplomatic coordination ensuring proper distribution of sacred remains that maintain political legitimacy across fragmented medieval kingdoms. Different noble families develop elaborate protocols governing which body parts receive priority placement in various religious institutions, creating networks of sacred sites that reinforce political authority through distributed royal presence even after death. What divided devotion still rests in scattered shrines where royal hearts beat eternal in golden chambers. You're crossing vast Siberian steppes, where nomadic Scythian warriors created the most artistically sophisticated funeral custom ever discovered by archaeologists, creating elaborate tattoo galleries on deceased bodies before burial in permafrost. Conditions that maintain intricate skin art for over 2 millennia. These remarkable frozen mummy preparations involve master tattoo artists working with natural pigments and precious materials while families commission complex designs representing spiritual journeys, tribal affiliations, and personal achievements preserved in permanent body decoration that serves as biographical artwork. Picture communities gathering precious materials, including gold leaf, natural dyes, and sacred symbols, while skilled artists transform deceased warriors into living manuscripts that chronicle nomadic culture through sophisticated skin-based storytelling techniques passed down through generations. The practice requires expert tattoo artists trained in both artistic techniques and spiritual symbolism, plus sophisticated understanding of preservation methods that maintain skin integrity during burial preparation and long-term frozen storage in Siberian permafrost conditions. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing perfectly preserved tattooed mummies whose elaborate skin art provides unprecedented insights into ancient artistic traditions, spiritual beliefs, and social hierarchies among nomadic Scythian communities. What eternal art still decorates those frozen galleries where skin became canvas for nomadic souls? Dear listeners, look upward into the dense Papua New Guinea rainforests, where Highland communities construct the most vertically ambitious funeral architecture imaginable, building elaborate treehouse burial chambers that create aerial villages for deceased family members who continue watching over jungle territories from elevated forest positions. These remarkable elevated platforms involve expert climbers working with traditional materials and rope systems, while families transport their loved ones to canopy-level burial chambers accessible only through dangerous climbing techniques that require considerable skill and courage to navigate safely. You're witnessing communities maintaining these sky-bound cemeteries where wooden platforms house multiple generations of family members in aerial burial complexes that require constant maintenance through risky climbing expeditions during monsoon seasons and tropical storms. The practice creates unique funeral ecosystems where death becomes completely integrated with forest canopy life cycles, with burial platforms supporting epiphyte gardens and providing nesting sites for various bird species that participate in these elevated cemetery communities. Different highland tribes develop unique treehouse burial styles based on local forest conditions, available timber resources, and specific spiritual beliefs about proper relationships between deceased ancestors and living forest ecosystems that support traditional hunting and gathering lifestyles. What ancient whispers drift through forest crowns where treehouse villages shelter souls among the leaves. You're joining medieval European communities in the most socially equalizing funeral custom ever choreographed, where personified death personally leads elaborate street processions that include people from every social class toward their inevitable shared destiny in carefully planned democratic demonstrations of mortality. These haunting dance macabre pageants involve entire town populations participating in choreographed dances while musicians play specific melodies that transform collective fear into philosophical acceptance of mortality's universal democracy that makes all earthly distinctions meaningless. Picture nobles, wealthy merchants, humble peasants, and powerful clergy, all following death's impartial lead through narrow cobblestone streets while crowds of spectators witness these powerful visual reminders that earthly status, wealth, and power mean absolutely nothing when faced with eternal judgment and divine justice. The practice requires skilled costume makers creating elaborate death masks and robes, plus experienced choreographers designing specific dance movements that represent different social classes, symbolically surrendering their worldly pretensions to death's equalizing power. Communities commission talented artists to paint permanent danse macabre murals on church walls, creating enduring visual reminders of death's democracy that survive long after the living dancers join their painted predecessors in eternal rest. What ancient steps still guide those mortal dances, where kings and commoners follow death's eternal choreography together?